In the autumn of 1806, a stunning proclamation from President Thomas Jefferson sent a shockwave across the young United States. It warned of a conspiracy, a secret expedition of armed men forming on the western rivers with a purpose unfriendly to the peace of the Union. It called for the immediate arrest of the plot's ringleader, a man whose name was known in every household from the drawing rooms of Philadelphia to the log cabins of the frontier, former Vice President Aaron Burr. The news was unthinkable. This was a man who had stood just one heartbeat from the presidency, a hero of the revolution, a founder of the nation. Now he was a fugitive, accused of the ultimate crime, treason. What had happened? What dark ambition could drive a man of such stature to raise a private army in the Appalachian wilderness? Was he a patriot preparing for a secret war against Spain, or a would-be emperor plotting to shatter the fragile American Republic and carve out his own kingdom in the West? Today, we will become detectives of the past, sifting through the forgotten clues of this grand and shadowy plot to finally answer the question, who was the real Aaron Burr? To understand the tragedy that unfolded, you first have to understand the world that was at risk. Not just the lives of a few men, but the very soul of a young nation. In 1805, the United States was less a single unified country and more a fragile alliance between the settled, powerful East and the wild, restless West. The Appalachian Mountains were the great dividing line, and the people who lived in their shadow felt like a nation unto themselves. They were veterans paid in land they had to fight for, Scots-Irish settlers who bowed to no authority but their own, and pioneers who saw the federal government not as a protector, but as a distant collection of politicians who neither understood nor cared about their struggles. Their lifeline, the mighty Mississippi River, was choked off at its mouth by the Spanish, who held New Orleans. To them, the Union felt like a promise broken. At the heart of this volatile frontier, there was a literal paradise, a place that symbolized everything that stood to be lost. On an island in the Ohio River, a wealthy Irish aristocrat named Harmon Blennerhassett had built a dream. Fleeing scandal in Europe, he and his brilliant wife, Margaret, had constructed a stunning white mansion, a beacon of European culture in the American wilderness. It was filled with telescopes, lavish libraries, and fine art. From its portico, one could hear music and scientific debate instead of the cry of the panther. Blennerhassett was a dreamer, a romantic, a man more at home with a chemistry experiment than a rifle. He sought a life of refined intellectual peace, far from the intrigues of the old world. His wife, Margaret, was his equal in every way, a poet, an accomplished horsewoman, and a gracious host who made their island a legendary oasis of hospitality. They had 2 young sons and a fortune they believed was secure. Their world was one of beauty, science, and domestic tranquility, an idyllic existence carved right out of the rugged frontier. They were not the only ones with a stake in the future. All along the river valleys, thousands of families had gambled everything on this new land. They had cleared the forests, fought off disease, and planted their hopes in the rich, dark soil. Their lives were hard, their dreams simple: to own their land, to provide for their children, and to have a say in their own destiny. They were a proud, tough, and deeply dissatisfied people, their hearts filled with a simmering resentment against the East and a burning hunger for the opportunities they believed lay just beyond the horizon. This, then, was the world that existed before the serpent entered the garden. A fragile nation, a perfect island paradise, and a populace of hardy frontiersmen, all vulnerable in their own ways. They were a collection of dreamers, idealists, and fighters, unknowingly waiting for a charismatic leader to ignite their passions and lead them toward a new destiny or toward their own destruction. The crime, in this case, was not discovered with a single gunshot or a body in a ravine. It was discovered in pieces, a slow dawning horror that spread through the Appalachian territories like a fever. The crime scene was the entire Ohio River Valley, and the clues were not stains of blood, but the sounds of hammers and the whispers of restless men. The epicenter of it all was Harmon Blennerhassett's idyllic island. The once peaceful estate had been transformed. The music and philosophical debates were replaced by the ring of blacksmiths' anvils and the thud of axes. Locals paddling past the island in their skiffs saw things that made no sense. A fleet of 15 massive keelboats was being constructed, far more than any group of simple settlers would need. Harmon Blennerhassett, the gentle scholar, had turned the grand halls of his mansion into a workshop, using his fireplaces to kiln dry the wood for the boats. Huge quantities of supplies were being stockpiled: barrels of pork, sacks of flour, and casks of whiskey, enough to sustain an army, not a handful of families heading to a new farm. The most unsettling clues were the men themselves. Young, rootless, and ambitious men from Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Kentucky began to gather on the island. They weren't farmers. They carried new rifles and spoke not of planting seasons, but of adventure and glory. When questioned, they were evasive, offering a sly grin and a vague promise of riches to be won in the South. The story changed depending on who was telling it. Some said they were off to settle the Bastrop Tract, a massive land grant in Texas. Others winked and spoke of a secret government mission to fight the Spanish. The scene spoke of a grand conspiracy unfolding in plain sight, yet its true purpose remained maddeningly obscure. Was this an elaborate land speculation, as Burr publicly claimed? Or was it the secret mobilization of a patriot army waiting for the president's signal to march on Spanish territory? Or was it something far darker, the birth of a rebel force preparing to turn its guns on its own country? The wilderness offered no easy answers, only a multitude of unsettling questions that grew louder with every plank nailed into place. At the center of this storm of rumor and preparation stood one man, the obvious and immediate suspect: Aaron Burr. This was not some backwoods rabble-rouser. This was a political giant, a fallen angel of the Republic. By 1805, Burr was a political ghost, a man whose career had been immolated in the fires of scandal. As vice president, he had been sidelined and distrusted by Thomas Jefferson. Then came the final, fatal blow, his duel with Alexander Hamilton. By killing his great rival, Burr had made himself a pariah in the East, a man reviled in the very halls of power he had once commanded. His motive, whispered from the taverns of Pittsburgh to the halls of Congress, was not simple greed, but something far more potent: a burning desire for revenge. This entire Western enterprise was seen as a grand and audacious act of personal vengeance against the nation and the man who had cast him out. Burr felt betrayed by the American political system, and his ambition was to build a new empire in the West, so powerful and glorious that it would dwarf the United States. He would show Jefferson, he would show all of them, what a mistake they had made. To the people in the East, his actions weren't about settling land. They were about settling a score. The initial evidence was Burr himself, and the godlike manner in which he traveled through the wilderness. He journeyed down the Ohio not in a humble canoe, but on a magnificent 60-foot barge, a floating mansion complete with a dining hall and wine cellar. Imagine the spectacle, this vessel of Eastern luxury gliding past the rough log cabins of the frontier. It was a statement of power and intent, the procession of a king, not the humble transport of a pioneer. Whispers followed him everywhere, born of his almost hypnotic personal charm. Witnesses described a man with piercing dark eyes who could hold a room captive with his words. He didn't just ask for support. He seduced men into his vision. He made every farmer, every militia captain, every wealthy planter feel as though they were the single most important person to the success of his grand and secret enterprise. The sheer number of influential men who flocked to his banner was damning evidence in itself. From the moment his grand barge appeared on the river, there was no doubt who the leader was. Every rifle purchased, every boat built, every secret oath sworn in the dead of night pointed directly back to one man, the disgraced Vice President, Aaron Burr. But as grand as Burr's ambition was, He wasn't acting alone. He couldn't be. To seize New Orleans and control the West, he needed more than a few dozen frontiersmen in keelboats. He needed a military man on the inside, a powerful ally who could deliver the U.S. Army itself into his hands. He had such a partner, a man whose position made the entire scheme seem not just possible, but destined for success. General James Wilkinson, the commanding general of the entire United States Army and the governor of the Louisiana Territory. He was Burr's most trusted confidant, his co-conspirator, the sword that would carve out their new empire. And here, my friends, is where the story twists from a simple tale of ambition into a shadowy labyrinth of deceit. For what no one in Burr's inner circle knew, what the frontiersmen flocking to his banner could never have imagined, was that General Wilkinson, the highest-ranking soldier in the United States, was living a lie. For years, he had been a secret agent on the payroll of the Spanish government, known to his handlers only as Agent 13. Wilkinson's loyalty was not to Aaron Burr, nor was it to President Jefferson. His true master was himself, and his motive was a toxic cocktail of greed and a desperate instinct for self-preservation. He was playing the most dangerous game imaginable, promising support to Burr's conspiracy while feeding information to his Spanish masters, all while maintaining his position as America's top general. With this horrifying truth in mind, all of Wilkinson's actions snap into a darker focus. His letters to Burr, filled with encouragement and bold promises of delivering New Orleans, were not the communications of a loyal partner. They were the calculated words of a master manipulator, luring Burr deeper and deeper into the trap. He fanned the flames of Burr's ambition, assuring him that the army was ready, that the Creole population of New Orleans would welcome him as a liberator. Each promise was another thread in the web he was weaving around his supposed friend. His apparent support was pure theater, a performance for an audience of one. Re-examined, every action reeks of a darker truth. Wilkinson was not helping Burr build an empire. He was helping him build a gallows. He waited, letting Burr invest his money, his reputation, and the lives of his followers. He let the conspiracy grow just large enough to be a credible threat, all the while holding an axe over its neck, positioning himself to be the hero who would eventually save the very nation he was helping to endanger. The greatest threat to Aaron Burr wasn't the president in Washington, but the trusted brother-in-arms standing right beside him. But the conspiracy wasn't just a drama between American titans. The Appalachian frontier was not some isolated stage. It was the explosive friction point between competing empires, a grand chessboard where the players were not just ambitious individuals, but entire nations. Beyond the personal vendettas and internal betrayals, there was a third looming force at play, the shadowy hand of foreign powers, particularly Great Britain and Spain. They were the external threat, the silent partners whose interests stood to be served by chaos on the American frontier. Their motives were as cold and impersonal as they were powerful. Great Britain, still stinging from its defeat in the Revolution, saw in Burr's plan a golden opportunity to fracture and weaken its upstart rival. A new, independent Western Republic, hostile to the United States and friendly to the Crown, would be a strategic masterstroke. It would halt American expansion and give Britain effective control over the Mississippi River and the heart of the continent. The British minister in Washington, Anthony Merry, listened with great interest to Burr's proposals, seeing a chance to undo the results of the war. Spain, on the other hand, was a crumbling empire motivated by pure fear. They looked at the aggressive, land-hungry American frontiersmen pouring over the Appalachians and saw an existential threat to their most valuable colonial possession, silver-rich Mexico. For the Spanish, Burr's plot was both a terrifying danger and a potential solution. A successful invasion would be a catastrophe, but a civil war that turned Americans against each other could keep them occupied for decades, protecting the Spanish border through mutual destruction. This foreign meddling created a poisonous paranoia that seeped into every settlement along the river. Who could be trusted? Locals spoke of well-dressed strangers with European accents appearing in frontier taverns, men with heavy coin purses and too many questions. Rumors spread that the incredible sums of money funding Burr's expedition were not coming from his own ruined fortune, but from the coffers of a foreign king. This wasn't just a domestic rebellion anymore. It was an international intrigue, and the hardy folk of Appalachia were being courted, manipulated, and used as pawns in a game whose rules they didn't understand, by forces whose ultimate loyalty was to a distant throne. The initial pursuit of Aaron Burr was not a chase through the mountains, but a maddening hunt through a wilderness of lies. Burr, a master of political intrigue, had constructed a labyrinth of false trails and red herrings so brilliant that it paralyzed his enemies and confused his friends. The investigation, led from a distance by a deeply worried President Jefferson, repeatedly crashed against the wall of Burr's plausible deniability. The most powerful of these false trails was the public and seemingly legitimate one, the settlement of the Bastrop Tract. Burr had purchased a massive disputed land claim on the Ouachita River in what is now Louisiana. To the world, he was simply the leader of a land company, gathering brave pioneers to build a new life in the West. It was the perfect cover. Every boat built, every barrel of flour purchased, every man recruited could be explained away as a necessary preparation for this grand, legal settlement. When local officials came snooping, they were shown land deeds and contracts. Burr would greet them with the disarming charm of a respectable businessman, asking, "Gentlemen, is it now a crime in this republic to seek one's fortune?" The lead would go cold. For those who weren't satisfied by the simple story of a land venture, Burr had a more intoxicating bait: the patriot's cloak. He would take a man like Andrew Jackson aside and, in a low, confidential tone, hint that this entire expedition was a secret plan, tacitly approved by the administration in Washington. War with Spain was imminent, he'd suggest, and his force of hardy frontiersmen was meant to be the vanguard of the American army, ready to seize Texas or even Mexico the moment hostilities began. This masterstroke of misdirection turned potential accusers into enthusiastic allies. How could you arrest a man who was carrying out the president's secret orders? Back in Washington, Thomas Jefferson was wrestling with shadows. The reports that reached him were a maddening torrent of contradictions. One letter would paint Burr as a traitorous madman, the next as a misunderstood patriot. The vastness of the Appalachian frontier swallowed the truth. Messengers took weeks to travel, and by the time Jefferson could act on a piece of intelligence, the situation on the ground had already changed. He dispatched agents to the Ohio, but they too became lost in the fog of rumor. The investigation was dying a death of 1,000 dead ends. The posse would gather, ready to act on a damning rumor, only to find Burr had already sailed downriver, leaving behind a camp of men who swore they were just simple farmers. Promising leads evaporated in the Appalachian mist. This growing frustration in Washington and the rising confusion on the frontier was exactly what Burr intended. His campaign of misdirection was his greatest weapon, allowing his conspiracy to grow in plain sight, shielded by a brilliant wilderness of lies. President Jefferson's agents quickly discovered they were not just fighting against Aaron Burr, they were fighting against the entire culture of the Appalachian frontier. When they arrived in the bustling river towns and isolated homesteads to ask questions, they were met with a wall of silence, as thick and impenetrable as the mountain laurel. Doors were politely shut in their faces. Men in taverns would suddenly fall quiet, turning to stare into their mugs of ale. Neighbors who saw everything suddenly saw nothing. Those who heard the feverish preparations heard only the wind in the trees. You see, this was not the silence of simple ignorance. It was a deliberate collective act of defiance born from a deep and abiding distrust of the federal government. To these people, the men from Washington were the outsiders, the tax collectors, the agents of Eastern bankers who held their land titles. Aaron Burr, by contrast, was one of them. He was a war hero, a man of action, an enemy of the very Eastern elite they despised. Asking a Kentucky farmer to betray Aaron Burr to a federal agent was like asking him to side with the fox against his own hounds. It went against the grain of his very soul. This silence was also rooted in a shared dream. Burr wasn't just selling a conspiracy, he was selling hope. His vision of a Western empire, of conquering the riches of Mexico, became their vision. Their sons and brothers were the young men signing up for the expedition. Their crops were feeding the recruits, their whiskey filling the barrels on the boats. The entire region was complicit, bound together by a web of kinship, commerce, and a mutual gamble on a glorious future. To speak against Burr was to speak against their own community, against their own aspirations, and against the prospect of a better life that felt, for the first time, within their grasp. The psychological toll on anyone who considered breaking the code was immense. A man who voiced his doubts about Burr at the local store might find himself ostracized, his credit suddenly no good. A ferryman who reported the movement of armed men might find his boat mysteriously cut adrift in the night. There was no need for overt threats. The fear of retribution was a cold, unspoken understanding. In a land where a man's survival depended on his neighbors, isolation was a death sentence. And so, the people saw nothing, heard nothing, and said nothing, creating a perfect, silent incubator where treason could grow in the open air. For months, the conspiracy had been protected by Burr's masterful deceptions and the frontier's code of silence. But the turning point, the clue that finally broke the case wide open, did not come from a dusty attic or a deathbed confession. It came in a sealed dispatch, carried by military courier across hundreds of miles of wilderness, penned by the hand of the conspiracy's most important architect. The clue was a letter, and the man who wrote it was General James Wilkinson. Stationed in Louisiana, far from the prying eyes of the East, Wilkinson played his double game as long as he could. But by the late autumn of 1806, he realized the plot was faltering. The expected money from Britain hadn't arrived, recruitment was slower than hoped, and President Jefferson was growing more suspicious by the day. Wilkinson saw that the ship was sinking, and he decided his best move was not just to jump, but to set the entire vessel on fire and claim the reward for sounding the alarm. He chose a side, and it was his own. The letter that arrived on President Jefferson's desk was a masterpiece of calculated treachery. To save himself, Wilkinson had to portray Burr as the greatest villain the Republic had ever known, and himself as the loyal soldier who had uncovered the plot. He laid out the conspiracy in the most terrifying terms imaginable. He spoke of a plan to seize New Orleans, rob the banks, incite a civil war, and create a Western empire with Burr on the throne. He painted Burr not as a mere adventurer, but as an American Napoleon, a devil whose ambition threatened the very existence of the United States. This letter was the forgotten clue that had been hiding in plain sight all along, the word of a traitor. For Jefferson, it was the moment of horrifying clarity. The fog of rumor was instantly burned away. The contradictory reports, the whispers, the vague warnings, they were all replaced by this one damning account from the highest-ranking general in the army. The labyrinth of lies that Burr had so carefully constructed collapsed in an instant. The letter changed everything. There was no more room for doubt, no more need for cautious investigation. The threat was real, it was imminent, and its full, treasonous scope was finally laid bare. A renewed and terrible urgency seized the capital. The time for waiting was over. The time for action was now. The moment Jefferson broke the seal on that letter, the game was over, and the manhunt was about to begin. With Wilkinson's damning letter in hand, President Thomas Jefferson acted. He issued a presidential proclamation that swept down the Ohio and Mississippi rivers like a flood, a single sheet of paper that tore away the web of lies and unmasked Aaron Burr before the entire nation. The proclamation ordered all civil and military officers to seize the illegal expedition, its boats, its supplies, and its leader. There was no more ambiguity, no more talk of secret government plans or peaceful settlement. The President of the United States had officially branded Aaron Burr a traitor. The news shattered the conspiracy. For the young men gathered on Blennerhassett Island and in camps along the river, the unmasking was a moment of brutal awakening. The dream of Mexican silver and grand adventure evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark reality of treason. They weren't patriots in waiting. They were outlaws, fugitives in their own country. The cause they had pledged their lives to was revealed as a criminal enterprise. And what was the true plot? The one hidden beneath all the layers of deceit. The forgotten clues, the letters between the conspirators, and Wilkinson's own self-serving confession finally revealed the chilling truth. Burr's plan was a masterpiece of flexible ambition. The first step was to lead his army of frontiersmen to New Orleans. He would seize the city, its federal arsenal, and its treasury. From there, his options would open up. If the moment was right, he would persuade the western states, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio, to secede from the Union and form a new Western empire with himself as its head. If secession proved difficult, he would use the captured funds and weapons to launch his own private invasion of Spanish Mexico, conquering its silver mines and crowning himself Emperor Aaron I. His motive was a volcanic mixture of personal revenge and grandiose destiny. Scorned by the nation he had helped to build, he sought to create a new one in his own image, a vigorous, martial empire free from the constraints of Jeffersonian democracy. He saw himself not as a traitor, but as a new Napoleon, a man of action destined to forge a continent. But as Burr was unmasked as a traitor to his country, a second, more profound unmasking was taking place in the shadows of history. The man who brought him down, General James Wilkinson, was revealed to be a traitor of a different order. He was a man who betrayed everyone. He betrayed Spain by plotting with Burr. He betrayed Burr by exposing him to Jefferson. And he betrayed the United States by serving as a paid foreign agent while commanding its armies. The Great Burr Conspiracy was not ultimately foiled by loyal patriots. It was cannibalized from within, brought down by the successful treachery of its second-in-command, a man whose only motive was his own survival and profit. This was the final, ugly truth. The plot to create a new empire was destroyed by an even deeper, more personal betrayal. The president's words fell upon the frontier not like rain, but like shards of ice. The proclamation, spreading from rider to rider, shattered the grand conspiracy in 1,000 pieces. On Blennerhassett Island, the heart of the enterprise, the dream died in a single night of chaos. The Virginia militia descended not upon a disciplined military camp, but upon a confused and terrified group of men who now understood they had been betrayed. With Burr and Blennerhassett already downriver, the abandoned recruits, their hopes of glory and riches turned to ash, unleashed their fury on the paradise that had lured them in. Through the eyes of Margaret Blennerhassett, who had been left behind, paradise was lost in a symphony of destruction. She didn't see a battle, she heard the end of a world. She heard the splintering crash of fine cherrywood as elegant furniture was broken apart. The air filled with the sharp, sickening sound of shattering Venetian glass and the reek of whiskey spilled on priceless Persian rugs. She heard the drunken shouts of men she had once fed at her own table, their voices no longer filled with hope, but with a bitter, aimless rage. In the main hall, dark, ragged holes began to appear in the fine linen draperies, the silent witnesses of a dream being shot to pieces. Forced to flee with her children into the freezing December night, her only transport was an open riverboat. As it was pushed out into the icy current, she looked back at her magnificent home, its windows blazing with light, not from a joyous party, but from the fires set within by the rampaging men. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing silence as her home, her dream, and her future were consumed by the darkness. Miles downriver, Aaron Burr himself heard the news of Wilkinson's betrayal and Jefferson's proclamation. The unmasking was absolute. In an instant, his grand design crumbled. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne was now forced into the disguise of a common boatman, hoping to slip through the net that was closing around him. He became a fugitive, his flight a desperate scramble toward the Spanish territory in Florida. The end came not in a blaze of glory on a battlefield, but in a muddy swamp in the backwoods of what is now Alabama. He was not cornered in a heroic last stand. He was simply recognized by his aristocratic bearing and his fine, elegant boots, mired in the filth. The would-be emperor was captured without a single shot being fired. The Grand Western Army was no more. The boats were impounded, the men scattered to the winds, and the beautiful mansion on the island stood silent and ravaged, a monument to a spectacular failure. The conspiracy was over, ending not with a bang, but with the hollow echo of a dream breaking. Aaron Burr was brought to Richmond, Virginia, to stand trial for treason, and what followed was not merely a legal proceeding, but a political war waged in a courtroom. It was a spectacle that gripped the entire nation. In one corner stood President Thomas Jefferson, consumed with a burning, almost personal need to see his old rival hanged. In the other corner sat the judge, the formidable Chief Justice John Marshall, a man who was not only Jefferson's political enemy, but also his cousin. And at the center of it all was Aaron Burr, who, far from being a broken-down prisoner, acted as his own lead counsel, his brilliant legal mind as sharp and dangerous as ever. The atmosphere in Richmond was electric. The city swelled with crowds, a chaotic mix of statesmen, lawyers, frontiersmen who had come to testify, and curious onlookers eager for a glimpse of the great traitor. The prosecution, backed by the full power of the presidency, presented a mountain of evidence detailing Burr's grand ambitions and military preparations. Jefferson himself from Washington attempted to micromanage the case, convinced that the very survival of the Republic depended on a guilty verdict. But Chief Justice Marshall saw the trial through a different lens. He saw the danger not just from Burr's ambition, but from a president willing to bend the law to destroy a political foe. Marshall stood firm on a strict, narrow definition of treason as laid out in the Constitution itself. He instructed the jury that to be guilty of treason, a person must commit an overt act of war against the United States. Simply plotting to do so, gathering men, or speaking of empire was not enough. The prosecution had to prove that Burr's army had actually levied war, which of course it never had. There had been no battle, no shots fired at American troops. The president's fury was immense, but the Chief Justice would not yield. Trapped by this strict constitutional standard, the prosecution's case collapsed. They could prove intent, they could prove conspiracy, but they could not prove an overt act of war. After all the drama, all the testimony, and all the political maneuvering, the jury returned its verdict. Not guilty. Aaron Burr, the man who dreamed of empire and set the entire West ablaze, walked out of the courtroom a free man. The verdict was a stunning legal victory, but a profound moral failure in the eyes of many. Jefferson was enraged, the public was bewildered, and the frontiersmen who had followed Burr were left ruined and betrayed. While legally innocent of treason, Burr was found guilty in the court of public opinion. He was a free man, but his name was forever destroyed, his honor gone. The verdict, a landmark in American law, remains controversial to this day. A verdict that still sparks arguments in these hills about whether justice was truly served, or if the greatest traitor of them all simply got away with it. The storm of the Burr conspiracy had passed, but the wreckage was strewn across a generation. Though acquitted, Aaron Burr was a ruined man. He became a living ghost, a specter of his former self, ostracized from the country he had once helped to lead. He spent years in self-imposed exile in Europe, still scheming, still trying to find a foreign monarch to back his imperial dreams, but he was a man without a country and without credibility. He eventually returned to America and spent his final decades as an obscure lawyer in New York City, haunted by the shadows of what might have been. The man who dreamed of an emperor's throne died in relative poverty, his name forever synonymous not with founder, but with traitor. For Harmon and Margaret Blennerhassett, the dream had become a permanent nightmare. Their island paradise was a memory, their mansion a looted shell, their fortune gone. Harmon was arrested and spent months in a Richmond prison before the charges were dropped in the wake of Burr's acquittal. But his freedom was a hollow victory. Hounded by debt and disgrace, the couple wandered for years, from Mississippi to Canada to the Caribbean, trying to rebuild their lives, but they never recovered. Harmon died in poverty, and Margaret's final years were spent petitioning a Congress that had long forgotten her for some compensation for their ruined home. The idyllic life they had built in the wilderness was the first and most tragic casualty of Burr's ambition. But not everyone was destroyed. In Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, the fiery general who had been so taken with Burr, emerged from the scandal not only unscathed, but strengthened. He had been cautious, demanding proof that Burr's plans were sanctioned by the government. When that proof never came, and Wilkinson's betrayal was revealed, Jackson swiftly and publicly distanced himself from the plot, positioning himself as a loyal patriot who had been misled. The affair taught him a valuable lesson in political survival and reinforced his reputation as a shrewd and decisive leader. His brush with Burr's treason did nothing to slow his own meteoric rise to power. And the arch-traitor himself, General James Wilkinson, the man who had betrayed Spain, Burr, and the United States, he was never held to account. Despite a congressional investigation that uncovered his long history as a Spanish spy, he was exonerated, his web of lies and influence proving too thick to penetrate. He retained his command, continued his career, and died years later, the ultimate survivor of the web of lies he himself had spun. His fate was perhaps the story's bitterest lesson, that in the murky world of power, the greatest crimes are sometimes the ones that go unpunished. Even now, more than 2 centuries later, the traces of this grand and failed dream have not vanished from the land. The conspiracy is not just a story in a history book, it is a scar left on the map of Appalachia, a memory etched into the landscape itself. If you travel today to a small island in the Ohio River near Parkersburg, West Virginia, you can step right into the heart of the story. Blennerhassett Island is now a state park. The magnificent Palladian mansion, destroyed by fire and the passage of time, has been meticulously reconstructed, its white columns rising once more from the wilderness. You can walk through its halls and stand on its portico, looking out at the same river that once carried Burr's ambitions, and it is almost impossible not to feel the ghosts of that hopeful, tragic autumn. But the island is not the only place the memory lives on. It lingers in the old stories, in the local folklore of the river valley. For generations after Burr fled, treasure hunters would search the caves and hollows along the Ohio. They were looking for Burr's lost treasure, chests of Spanish silver and gold that legend says he was forced to bury when he became a fugitive. No great treasure was ever found, of course, but the myth itself is a powerful echo of the original promise that lured men to his banner. The dream of unimaginable wealth, a shortcut to a better life, buried just beneath the Appalachian soil. The land itself has not forgotten. The Ohio River, the great artery of the conspiracy, still flows past the same towns, Marietta, Parkersburg, Cincinnati, that once buzzed with whispers of the coming expedition. Standing on its banks today, watching the slow-moving barges, it is easy to imagine the sight of Burr's keelboats filled with armed men slipping past in the pre-dawn mist on their way toward a destiny they could not yet see. The river remembers. It was the silent witness to the entire affair, from the first nail hammered into a boat to the final desperate flight of its leader. And so, the story endures, passed down not in textbooks, but in the heart of the region itself. It has become a part of the Appalachian identity, a cautionary tale about a man of great ambition who tried to harness the restless spirit of the frontier for his own glory. The world might forget the details of the Burr conspiracy, but the mountains, the rivers, and the people who live in their shadow hold on to these memories. They remember the charismatic devil who came down the river, the paradise that was lost, and the grand dream of a Western empire that almost tore the nation apart before it was ever truly whole. And so, we come back to the question that started our journey into the shadows of the past. Was Aaron Burr a misunderstood patriot, or was he a would-be emperor? The truth, as is so often the case in these mountains, is far more complicated. Burr was a mirror. To men like Andrew Jackson, he reflected their own patriotic desire to fight the Spanish. To the dreamer Harmon Blennerhassett, he reflected a vision of an enlightened new society. And to the restless young men of the frontier, he reflected their own hunger for glory and wealth. The terrible genius of Aaron Burr was his ability to be all of these things at once, a man whose true plan was so cloaked in ambiguity that it allowed everyone to see in it the fulfillment of their own deepest desires. But this is a story not just of one man's ambition. It is a timeless lesson on the fragility of a nation. The Burr conspiracy laid bare the deep and dangerous cracks in the foundation of the young American Republic. It showed how easily the souls of a proud and forgotten people can be stirred by a charismatic leader who speaks to their grievances. The resentments of the Appalachian settlers were real, their feeling of abandonment was justified, and their discontent created a powder keg that Burr, for a moment, held the match to. This story serves as a stark and chilling warning that a union is not held together by laws and documents alone, but by a shared sense of purpose and trust. When that trust is broken, when a part of the nation feels its voice is not heard, the door is opened for men like Aaron Burr. It is a tale of how personal vendetta can masquerade as political destiny, and how the dream of a more perfect union can so nearly be shattered by the dream of a private empire. And now, my friends, you know the story of the phantom empire that rose and fell on these western waters, or at least as much of it as the river is willing to give up. In the deepest folds of the Appalachian Mountains, there are valleys and hollows that have names. Names whispered by the old folks. Names like Moan Hollow. They say it wasn't the wind that gave it that name. It was the sorrow that soaked into the ground, a sorrow that belonged to one family, the Howards. For generations, their story was told not in letters, but in bruises and broken bones. A rage passed from father to son, as sure as their blue eyes and stubborn chin. The legends say it was a curse, a witch's dying breath, or a deal made with the devil in a dark coal mine. But what if the truth is something colder, something more terrifying than any ghost story? What if the monster wasn't a spirit from the woods, but a demon that lived right inside their own home, passed down like a family heirloom? Today, we will separate the rumors from the facts and find out what really happened to the men of the Howard family. Was it a curse that doomed them, or was it a chain of pain they forged themselves? Before it was called Moan Hollow, it was just a nameless fold in the earth, a sanctuary carved by a silver creek. The mountains rose up on all sides like silent green-robed giants, their peaks shrouded in a perpetual blue haze. It was a true oasis, hidden in the wild and rugged lands. The forests were thick with chestnut and oak, teeming with deer and turkey. The soil in the narrow bottomland was black and rich. It was a place where a man willing to work until his hands bled could build a life from nothing. And that's exactly what Jedediah Howard came to do. He was the first of them, a man who carried the chill of the Scottish Highlands in his bones and a fierce hunger in his heart. He'd left the old world behind, a world of landlords and famines, and saw in this untamed Appalachian wilderness a kingdom waiting to be claimed. He was a hard man, to be sure, with eyes as cold and clear as a winter stream, but his toughness was first turned against the land itself. He felled trees that were ancient when his grandfather was a boy. He broke the soil with his own back, and he raised a small, sturdy cabin stone by stone. For a time, there was peace in that hollow. Jedediah took a wife, a quiet woman named Elspeth, and soon the silence of the valley was broken by the cry of their firstborn son, Silas. Their life was a rhythm of seasons and survival. They were governed by the rising of the sun and the ache in their muscles. They feared the hard frost and the dry summer, but they feared little else. They were poor, but their barn was full. They were isolated, but they were self-sufficient. Jedediah had done it. He had carved out a piece of the world that was his, and his alone. But the mountains keep secrets. And the story the neighbors told was that this piece of the world hadn't been empty when Jedediah arrived. They said an old Cherokee woman had lived there, a healer who knew the secrets of the herbs that grew in the dark places of the woods. The official record says Jedediah bought the land fair and square, a simple transaction. But the whispers said something different. They said the deal was less of a purchase and more of an eviction. They said she didn't leave quietly. And so, a shadow lingered at the edge of their hard-won peace. Sometimes, Elspeth would swear she saw a flicker of movement by the ancient oak at the edge of the property. At night, when the fire burned low, the wind blowing through the gorge would sometimes sound like a mournful voice, a lament. Jedediah Howard had built his home, but he didn't know that the foundation was laid on a grievance. He believed he had conquered the wilderness, but he hadn't yet learned that some debts aren't paid with money, but with blood. The storm was gathering, and it would bear his family's name. Now, in the mountains, a good neighbor is worth more than a good mule, but Jedediah Howard never found one. The closest family, the Suttries, lived a mile down the creek, and they looked upon Jedediah's prosperity with a sour eye. The patriarch, Elias Suttry, was a man whose family had been hunting and trapping in these hills for 2 generations before the Howards arrived. He told anyone who would listen that the fertile bottomland Jedediah had claimed was promised to him, that he'd been on the verge of filing the deed himself. The Suttrys felt the land had been stolen right from under them, and their resentment simmered like a pot left too long on the fire. The old wound festered over a property line. A small creek separated their lands, and after a spring flood one year, the water changed its course, carving a new channel that gave a few more acres of rich soil to the Howards. To Jedediah, it was an act of God. To Elias Suttry, it was theft by water and a sign of Howard's devil's luck. It came to a head at the crossroads store, where words, sharp and heavy as stones, were thrown. No punches were exchanged, not yet, but a line was drawn. Suttry swore that creek would one day run with more than just rainwater. It wasn't spoken of loudly after that, but memories in the mountains are as long as a winter's night. This bitter dispute was the dry kindling, and the legend of the Cherokee woman was the spark. The Suttrys and their kin started repeating the story, adding their own dark embellishments. When one of Jedediah's cows took sick and died, it wasn't colic, it was the curse. When a late frost killed the Howards' apple blossoms, it wasn't the weather, it was the witch's revenge. The story of the curse became a social weapon, isolating the Howards and marking them as other. People who had once nodded a greeting now looked away. The Howard land, once seen as a testament to hard work, was now viewed as a place of bad blood. And so, the hollow became a pressure cooker. Inside the Howard cabin, the whispers from the outside world turned Jedediah's heart to granite. He saw enemies in every shadow. His wife Elspeth grew more withdrawn, her silence a constant, fearful prayer. And young Silas, he was being raised on a diet of resentment and suspicion. His father taught him to read the weather and to mend a fence, but the real lessons were unspoken. He learned that the world was hostile. He learned that a Howard trusts no one but another Howard. and he learned that any sign of weakness would be seized upon by your enemies. He was being forged in a crucible of suspicion and pride, being shaped into the perfect instrument to carry the family's legacy, whether it was a blessing or a curse. The harvest festival that year was supposed to be a time of truce. For one day, families set aside their grievances to celebrate the bounty of the land. There was music from a fiddle and banjo, the sweet smell of roasting meat, and the amber glow of moonshine being passed in a jar. And in that brief moment of peace, a dangerous seed took root. Silas Howard, now a young man with his father's solid build but his mother's quiet eyes, saw Sarah Suttree. She was Elias Suttree's youngest daughter, and a young man's heart doesn't care much for property lines or old grudges. They stole glances across the crowd, their secret a fragile spark in the midst of a simmering hate. That spark became a fire when the dancing started. Under the light of the harvest moon, Silas asked Sarah to dance. It was a reckless, defiant act. For the length of one song, they were just a boy and a girl, lost in the music, the world of their fathers fading away. But it was a world that wouldn't be ignored. Sarah's two older brothers, Caleb and Joshua, saw it all. They were their father's sons through and through, barrel-chested and quick to anger, and they saw a Howard's hands on their sister as the ultimate trespass. The music hadn't even finished before they pulled Sarah away and cornered Silas behind the barn. The first words weren't about the dance. They were about the land, the creek, the old rumors. They called him the son of a thief and a witch lover. They sneered that the curse was already showing in his eyes. Silas, raised on a strict diet of Howard pride, stood his ground. He didn't say a word, but his silence was louder than any shout. The taunts escalated, his family's name dragged through the mud with every curse. Then Joshua Suttree shoved him hard against the rough-hewn planks of the barn wall. Silas shoved back, and the festival was over. It was 2 against 1, a brutal, clumsy fight fueled by moonshine and generations of bad blood. Silas was strong, but they were stronger. They beat him to his knees, his face in the dirt. But as Caleb raised a heavy boot to stomp his hand, Silas's desperate eyes landed on a heavy wooden mallet left behind from setting up the tents. With a guttural roar, he lunged, swinging the mallet in a blind arc. There was a sickening crack of wood against bone. Caleb Suttree collapsed to the ground, his arm bent at an unnatural angle, a shard of white bone peeking through his skin. Blood, dark in the moonlight, soaked into the dry earth. The screams that followed silenced the fiddle for good. The community scattered, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire. Elias Suttree, his face a mask of pure fury, cradled his screaming son and pointed a trembling finger at Silas. "You'll pay for this, Howard," he choked out. "Your whole damned family will pay." Back in his own cabin that night, Jedediah didn't tend to his son's cuts and bruises. He looked at the blood on Silas's knuckles, at the fire in his eyes, and saw not a mistake, but a beginning. The whispers were over. The time for waiting was done. In both the Howard and Suttree homes that night, rifles were taken down from the wall and carefully, methodically cleaned. The first drops of blood had fallen, watering the seeds of a war that would consume them all. The revenge came not with a warning, but with the quiet mist of the following dawn. Jedediah Howard was at the woodpile, the rhythmic thud of his axe, a familiar heartbeat in the hollow. He was splitting kindling for the morning fire, a simple, honest chore. The air was still and damp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and wet earth. Then came a sound that didn't belong, a sharp crack that wasn't a breaking branch. The axe fell from Jedediah's hand, its blade burying itself in the dirt. He crumpled without a sound, a slow, heavy fall onto the very soil he had claimed as his own. From the cabin, Elspeth heard it, a mother's instinct, a wife's dread. She threw open the rough-hewn door, her question dying on her lips as she saw the dark shapes of Elias Suttree and his son Joshua emerging from the tree line, rifles in hand. The air filled with a blood-curdling scream, and then there was a dull thud, and the scream was cut short. A second crack echoed the first. Then an unnatural silence fell over the hollow, a silence so profound it seemed to swallow all other sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of the birds, everything. The world had turned into a hell of screams, followed by a ringing quiet. Silas was down by the creek, checking a rabbit snare he'd set the night before. He heard the two shots, spaced just far enough apart to be deliberate. A cold knot formed in his stomach. He didn't think, he ran. He sprinted through the woods, branches whipping at his face, his lungs burning. As he broke through the clearing, the sight of his home stopped him cold. The cabin door was swinging wide open, like a gaping mouth. There were no voices, no movement. The chickens were scattered across the yard, clucking in frantic terror. The silence was the most terrifying part. It was the silence of a place where life had just been violently erased. He crept inside, his heart hammering against his ribs. The single room was a scene of pure chaos. A table was overturned, chairs were splintered. A sack of flour had been torn open, casting a ghostly white powder over everything. And there, in the middle of the floor, a single dark boot print was pressed into the spilled flour. His eyes scanned the room, landing on a splash of crimson against the stark white. Near the cold hearth, his mother's favorite wool shawl, the one she was always mending, was cast aside in a heap. He backed out of the cabin, a silent denial screaming in his mind. And then he saw him. His father lay near the woodpile, a place of work, of life. He looked smaller somehow. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the misty sky he would never see again. The world for Silas shrank to that single still image. His father, the unmovable mountain of a man, now just a broken thing on the ground. In that moment, something inside Silas Howard broke. Or perhaps something was forged. The fear, the grief, it was all there, but it was instantly flash-frozen by a rage so pure and cold it burned. The tears would not come. The boy who had danced with Sarah Suttree under the harvest moon was gone, buried in the ashes of his home. In his place stood the son of Jedediah Howard, a vessel for a generation of hate, now filled to the brim. He didn't run to his father. He didn't cry out his mother's name. He walked, slowly and deliberately, to the woodpile. He looked down at his father's still face, the face that had taught him that the world was a hard and unforgiving place. Then he bent down. His hand closed around the smooth, worn handle of the fallen axe. As he lifted it, its weight felt familiar, righteous. The curse, whether real or imagined, had found its new champion. Silas Howard stood alone in the clearing, the axe in his hand feeling less like a tool and more like a part of his own arm. He did not weep. Tears were a luxury, and the price of vengeance was paid in sweat and resolve. With a grim, mechanical determination, he went to the small barn and retrieved 2 shovels. He chose a spot under the old oak tree at the edge of the property, the one his mother had always admired. And he began to dig. For hours, the only sound in Moan Hollow was the scrape and thud of a shovel biting into the earth, a solitary, heartbreaking rhythm. He carried his parents, one by one, and laid them to rest. He filled the graves himself, tamping down the soil with the back of his shovel, his movements precise and unhurried. There were no prayers said, no final words spoken. The act itself was the only eulogy. When the grim task was done, he did not go back into the cabin. He stood at the threshold and looked in at the scene of desecration, the spilled flour, the broken furniture, his mother's discarded shawl. This was no longer his home. It was a monument to a promise made in blood. He turned his back on it, leaving the door to swing on its hinges, an open invitation for the wind and the rain to come in and reclaim the place. He took only his father's rifle from the wall, a pouch of shot, a powder horn, and the axe. He walked away from the hollow without a single look back, melting into the deep woods that bordered his land. The hollow fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of a tomb. Word travels slowly in the mountains, but it travels surely. A few days later, a traveling preacher making his circuit found the Howard homestead unnervingly quiet. He saw the two fresh mounds of earth under the oak tree and knew instantly what they were. He didn't linger. He spurred his horse and carried the news to the nearest settlement. The story spread like a fever. It wasn't the killing that shocked people. Feuds and violence were a known part of life. It was the manner of it. The killing of a woman. An ambush at dawn. It was an act without honor, and it struck a chord of fear in the scattered community. Families who had feuds of their own looked at their neighbors with new eyes. Locks were bolted that had never been used before. The county sheriff, a portly man named Abernathy, who preferred settling disputes with talk rather than a gun, eventually made the ride out to the hollow. He saw the graves, noted the abandoned cabin, and then paid a visit to the Sutry family. Elias and his sons met him on their porch, their faces like stone masks. They denied everything. They'd been tending their own land, they said, and hadn't seen a soul. With no witnesses and no bodies to examine, Sheriff Abernathy's hands were tied. He made some notes in a dusty ledger, issued a stern warning about mountain justice, and rode away. The law in those mountains moved with the speed of an old man walking uphill, and in this case, it had come to a dead stop. But the story wasn't over. The community knew it. The Sutrys certainly knew it. Silas Howard was gone, but he wasn't dead. He had been swallowed by the mountains, the same ancient, unforgiving wilderness that had forged his father. He was out there, somewhere in the endless ridges and dark ravines. The manhunt had begun, but it wasn't the law that was doing the hunting. A ghost was now stalking Moan Hollow, and Elias Sutry and his sons began to understand that the two shots they had fired at dawn were not an ending, but the beginning of a reckoning. Every snapped twig in the woods, every shadow that moved at dusk, now held a terrifying new possibility. Silas Howard was no longer a name, but a whisper on the wind. There was no posse. Sheriff Abernathy had declared the matter closed, a family tragedy best left to the ghosts and the mountains. The hunt that began was a far more personal and primal affair. Elias Sutry and his remaining sons, Joshua and the one-armed Caleb, became both the hunters and the hunted. Their farm became a fortress, and they became its prisoners. They barred the windows at night and took turns standing watch, rifles cradled in their arms, their gazes fixed on the dark, whispering tree line that separated them from their unseen enemy. They were hunting a ghost, a boy they had created and then unleashed. But Silas Howard was no ghost. He was flesh and blood, and he was perfectly at home. The mountains that the Sutrys now saw as a terrifying wall of shadow, Silas saw as his sanctuary and his accomplice. He had been raised in these woods. He knew the hidden game trails, the secret springs, the shallow caves where a man could disappear. The mountains had taken Silas Howard in, adopted him as one of their own. He moved like a deer, lived off the land, and his senses became as sharp as a hawk's. He became a roomer with a rifle, a phantom whose presence was felt in the cold dread that settled over the Sutry homestead. Silas did not launch a direct assault. He was waging a war not on their bodies, but on their minds. The torment began with small, deliberate cruelties. One morning, Elias found a freshly killed rabbit hanging from his porch rail, skinned with the same distinctive knife stroke his own father had taught him. A few nights later, a rock shattered the kitchen window in the dead of night, and when they rushed outside, there was nothing but the chirping of crickets. They started hearing things, the distant rhythmic sound of an axe splitting wood deep in the forest, a low whistle on the wind that sounded like a tune Silas used to favor. He was everywhere and nowhere, a constant invisible pressure that began to fray their nerves raw. The Sutry brothers, once bold and arrogant, became twitchy and paranoid. Caleb, his useless arm, a constant reminder of the feud's beginning, was consumed by nightmares. Joshua, the more hot-headed of the two, grew reckless with fury. He'd fire his rifle into the shadows at the slightest sound, his shouts echoing unanswered in the night. The forest that had been his backyard his entire life was now a deadly labyrinth with a monster at its center. The father, Elias, saw his sons unraveling and his own iron will turning to rust. The fear was a poison, and Silas was letting it work its way deep into their souls before he delivered the final blow. The breaking point came a month into the siege. Driven by a mix of rage and cabin fever, Joshua Sutry declared he was going to hunt the hunter. Ignoring his father's pleas, he took his rifle and stormed into the woods, vowing to return with Silas Howard's scalp. He stalked through the familiar forest for hours, his anger making him clumsy, his shouts making him an easy target. As dusk began to bleed through the canopy, he found himself in a part of the woods he didn't recognize. A sudden snap of a twig behind him made him spin around. He saw nothing. A cold dread, colder than any winter morning, washed over him. He knew in that instant that he was not the hunter. He was the prey, and he had walked right into the center of the web. They found him at dawn, not 50 yards from his own tree line. Elias Sutry, his face a pale, haggard mask, followed the trail of broken branches his son had left. He didn't find a man. He found what was left. Joshua was slumped against the base of a massive pine tree. There was no sign of a struggle, no gunshot wound. A single dark mark on his temple showed where the butt of a rifle had struck with brutal final force. But it was the other detail that made Elias's blood run cold. Lying neatly on Joshua's chest was the family axe, the one Silas had taken from his father's woodpile. Its blade was clean. It had not been used to kill, but to send a message. One Sutry was down. The ghost had a taste for blood, and his work was not yet finished. There was no trial held in the county courthouse for the death of Joshua Sutry. The only court in session was the court of public opinion, and the verdict was delivered in hushed tones and averted eyes. When Elias and Caleb carried the pine box to the small family plot on the hill behind their house, only a handful of distant cousins came to stand with them. The rest of the community stayed away, their absence a silent, damning judgment. They weren't mourning Joshua, they were watching the Sutry family be consumed by a fire of their own making. The law of men had failed, and now the older, harsher law of the mountains was handing down its sentence. The Sutry homestead became a courtroom and a prison all in one. Elias and Caleb were the accused, and Silas Howard was the unseen judge, jury, and executioner. The farm began to die around them. Fences sagged, weeds choked the cornfields, and the livestock grew thin from neglect. How could they work the fields when their eyes were constantly scanning the tree line? How could they sleep when every creak of the floorboards sounded like an intruder? Elias, the once proud patriarch who ruled his family with an iron fist, was reduced to a hollow-eyed old man, watching his world crumble one terror at a time. The legacy he had fought to build was being systematically dismantled by the ghost of a boy he had wronged. Caleb, however, was haunted by more than just fear. With his useless dangling arm, a constant aching reminder of his role in starting the feud, his spirit began to break. He started drinking heavily, seeking courage in a jar of corn liquor that only brought forth the demons of his guilt. In his drunken stupors, he would whisper his mother-in-law's name, swearing he saw her face in the shadows. He raved about a curse, not the one they had mockingly pinned on the Howards, but a real one, a curse of blood they had brought upon themselves that day at dawn. The trial within the Sutry home reached its climax one moonless night. Fueled by whiskey and terror, Caleb finally turned on his father. He stood in the middle of the cabin, his one good hand trembling, and screamed the truth into the suffocating silence. He shrieked about the look in Elspeth Howard's eyes, about the silence after the second shot, about the blood on their hands that would never wash away. "It's him. He's not a man. He's a spirit. And he's come for us." Elias tried to silence him, to slap the hysteria out of him, but the dam of denial had burst. The truth, ugly and raw, now filled the space between them. The verdict was delivered just before the next sunrise. Caleb Suttree, stripped of his bravado and his sanity, seemed to find a strange and sudden calm. He walked out onto the porch, unarmed, his face pale in the grey pre-dawn light. He took a deep breath of the cold mountain air, and then, in a voice that was not a shout, but a weary plea, he called out a single name into the mist-shrouded woods. Silas. He stood there, a man offering himself up to the inevitable. A moment passed, then another. And then, from the dark, silent wall of trees, a single shot rang out, sharp and final. It was an answer, an execution, a mercy. Was this justice? A circuit judge would have called it murder. But in the hollows and hills, where life was cheap and honor was everything, the story was told differently. They said Silas Howard was simply balancing the scales. He had taken an eye for an eye, a son for a mother, a brother for a father. Elias Suttree was now utterly alone, a king of a dead and haunted kingdom, left to live with the ghosts he had created. The law of men had never laid a hand on him, but the justice of the mountains had delivered a sentence far worse than a hangman's noose. It had taken everything. Elias Suttree didn't die from a bullet. He died from silence. He lived out his remaining years in that hollow, a ghost in his own home, surrounded by the ghosts of his sons. His land went fallow, and his name withered on the vine. When he finally passed, no one was there to mark the occasion. The Suttree line, once a source of pride, ended in a weedy, forgotten grave on a lonely hillside. Their story became a cautionary tale about the price of hate. And Silas Howard, the avenging angel of the hollow, walked out of the mountains and into a bigger, bloodier war. When the nation split apart, he joined the Union Army, perhaps seeing in the chaos of the Civil War a place where a man with his particular skills could belong. He saw the horrors of Gettysburg, a slaughter that made his family feud look like a schoolyard scuffle. But the war didn't wash away his sins. It just baptized him in a new kind of hell. He returned a broken man, quiet and cold, the fire of righteous vengeance replaced by the hollow emptiness of trauma. It was this Silas, the soldier with the haunted eyes, who would eventually take a wife and have a son of his own, passing down not a name, but a darkness. The curse had found its vessel for the next generation. If you were to go looking for Moan Hollow today, you wouldn't find it on any map. But the locals could point the way. The Suttree place is gone, reclaimed entirely by the forest, a place where people say the weeds grow a little too thick and the birds sing a little less sweetly. The Howard cabin was swallowed by the woods too. All that remains today is a pile of moss-covered foundation stones and a single stubborn chimney standing like a tombstone for a home. They call it the Howard Chimney now, a local landmark where teenagers dare each other to spend the night. And the 2 mounds of earth under the ancient oak tree? They are still there, sunken and subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye. But they are there. The paper trail of this tragedy is thin, a few lines in a dusty county ledger about a land dispute. But the mountains have a longer memory. The story of the Howards and the Suttrees isn't written in ink. It's carved into the landscape itself, in the names people whisper, in the ruins they avoid after dark. Though most people have forgotten the details, the sorrow has soaked into the soil and the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question that started it all, the question whispered around campfires in these mountains for over a century. Was the Howard family doomed by a supernatural curse? It's a powerful story, the idea of a witch's hex or a deal with the devil. It gives a name to an evil that feels too big and too relentless to be human. But the truth, as it often is simpler and somehow far more tragic. The real curse wasn't a whisper on the wind. The real curse was the silence between neighbors nursing old grudges, the silence of a man who can't speak his pain, and the ringing, final silence after a gunshot. This is a story not just of cruelty, but of the formidable, unyielding Appalachian spirit, a spirit forged in hardship and isolation. It's a story of the fierce pride that can build a life on a steep mountainside with nothing but bare hands, and the terrible pride that can tear that same life apart over a single insult. The Howards weren't monsters. They were men, trapped in a cage built by poverty, ignorance, and trauma. Each generation inherited the pain of the last, and the only tool they were ever given to deal with that pain was rage. Silas Howard didn't learn his violence from a demon in a mine. He learned it in the silence of a father who never showed him love, and in the screams of a mother he couldn't protect. The names on the headstones have faded, and the cabins have crumbled back into the earth, but the lesson of Moan Hollow remains, a quiet warning carried on the mountain breeze. It teaches us that the most terrible ghosts are the ones we create ourselves, the ones that live inside our own families. The story of the Howards is a bitter parable about how a man can escape a war, can escape a hollow, but can never truly escape the legacy of his father's hands. And now, my friends, you know the story of Moan Hollow. And you know why the old folks say, even on a still day, the wind in that valley still sounds a little like weeping. The first shotgun blast threw her from the saddle into the cold, muddy water of the creek. She was still alive, crawling for the bank, when the second, more brutal blast tore through the air, silencing her forever. The newspapers called her the Bandit Queen, a velvet-clad phantom who rode with the James brothers and ruled the outlaws of the Indian Territory. But the truth was far messier and far more tragic than any dime novel could capture. Who would ambush a woman just 2 days shy of her 41st birthday and leave her to die in the mud? Today, we ride past the legends and the lies to find the real Belle Star, and to answer the question that still haunts that lonely patch of ground. Who pulled the trigger? Before the gun smoke and the legend, there was a girl named Myra Maybelle Shirley, born in 1848 into a world that was anything but lawless. Her home was near Carthage, Missouri, a land of rolling green hills and fertile soil that held a promise of prosperity. Her father, Judge John Shirley, was a man of standing, a prosperous farmer and innkeeper whose family lived a life of relative comfort and respectability. They were slave owners and fierce believers in the Southern cause, their identity deeply woven into the fabric of Missouri's divided soul. This was not a world of desperate poverty that breeds outlaws. The Shirley home was a place of order and aspiration. Young Myra was not raised in a dirt-floored cabin, but was sent to the Carthage Female Academy to receive a classical education. She learned literature, rhetoric, and became an accomplished pianist. You can almost picture it. A dark-haired girl with a stubborn set to her jaw, her fingers flying across the ivory keys, filling the respectable Shirley Inn with music that seemed to hold the roughness of the frontier at bay. She was known to be bright, quick-witted, and possessed of a temper that could flash like heat lightning. She was devoted to her family, particularly to her older brother John, whom everyone called Bud. He was the pride of the family, the embodiment of young Southern manhood, and Myra adored him. In those years, her future likely seemed as clear and orderly as a line of sheet music, a good marriage, a family of her own, a life of influence within her community. But their Missouri was a border state, a land of fault lines and hidden pressures. The very inn where Myra played piano was a crossroads of whispers and arguments. Men passing through spoke of states' rights, of abolitionists, of a nation tearing itself apart at the seams. For the Shirleys, these were not abstract political debates. They were matters of honor, identity, and survival. Every traveler brought news that seemed to darken the sky just a little bit more. The world of Myra Maybelle Shirley, the world of piano lessons, family pride, and southern gentility, was a fragile one. It was a stately home built on the edge of a volcano. Little did she know that the gathering storm of civil war would not just knock at their door, but blow it clean off its hinges, consuming her brother, destroying her family's fortune, and setting her own feet on a path of rebellion from which she would never turn back. To understand the fire that burned in Belle Starr, you have to understand the land that shaped her. Missouri in the 1850s was not a place of settled peace. It was a powder keg with a short fuse. It was a border state, a place where the deep South culture of the Shirleys, built on land and slaveholding, clashed daily with the free state ideals of their northern neighbors. For families like hers, their property wasn't just soil and buildings. It was a testament to a way of life they believed was righteous, a legacy they would defend with their blood. The Civil War was the spark that ignited that powder keg. This wasn't a conflict of distant armies marching under grand flags. In Missouri, it was a savage, intimate war fought in farmyards and on lonely country roads. It was a war of bushwhackers and jayhawkers, where your neighbor could be your executioner. This was the old scar that would never truly heal, a wound that split communities and families down to the bone. For the Shirleys, there was no question which side they were on. They were Confederates through and through. The weight of the Shirley name now demanded more than just respectability. It demanded action. And it was Myra's beloved brother Bud who would carry that burden into the fight. He didn't join a regular army. He joined a band of Confederate irregulars under the command of the infamous William Quantrill. Riding alongside him were other angry young farm boys whose names would later be written in blood and legend, the James brothers and the Younger Boys. Bud Shirley became a guerrilla, a shadow warrior in a war with no rules. For Myra, this wasn't politics, it was family. Her brother was fighting for their home, for their honor, against an invading force. When Union troops finally caught up with Bud in 1864 and killed him, it wasn't an act of war in her eyes. It was murder. The Union and the entire system of law and government it represented became the sworn enemy of her clan. The feud wasn't with another family over a property line, it was with the United States of America. Her grief hardened into a cold, lifelong vow of defiance. The seeds of the Bandit Queen were planted right there in the blood-soaked soil of Missouri. Long before the war ended, the Shirley Inn had become more than just a resting place for travelers. It was a safe house, a quiet harbor for the Confederacy's most daring and dangerous guerrilla fighters. You have to understand, men like Jesse James and Cole Younger weren't just abstract legends passing through. They were Bud's friends. They were boys Myra knew, young men who sat in her family's parlor, listening to her play the piano while their Colts rested heavy on their hips. Her music was the only moment of peace in their world of ambush and reprisal, and this shared experience forged a bond of loyalty that ran deeper than any law. When the war was lost and the Shirleys were forced to relocate to Syene, Texas, they carried those old loyalties and grudges with them like family heirlooms. They were surrounded by other displaced Southern families, all of them nursing the bitter wound of defeat. In this world, the new Reconstruction-era lawmen weren't seen as protectors. They were seen as occupiers, the enforcers of a victor's justice. A man's worth was judged not by his adherence to this new law, but by his loyalty to the old cause. Whispers travel like wildfire in a place like that, and they clung to Myra Maybelle Shirley. Her association with the Younger clan was common knowledge, and the rumors of a youthful romance with the handsome Cole Younger followed her everywhere. It didn't matter if it was true. What mattered was the perception. She was marked, seen as part of that defiant, dangerous world. She wasn't just Judge Shirley's educated daughter anymore. She was the girl who kept company with outlaws, a woman who understood their codes and shared their enemies. This web of associations poisoned the air, turning small disagreements into matters of life and death. When Myra fell for Jim Reed, it was no surprise that he was one of their own, another former bushwhacker, a man who knew the taste of battle and had no love for the authorities. Her family objected, seeing in Reed the violence and uncertainty that had already cost them a son. But Myra's defiance was absolute. Marrying him was an act of choosing her side once and for all. The ground was now perfectly fertile for conflict. The community was a tinderbox of Civil War resentments. Myra's own reputation was already stained with the smoke of rebellion, and she had bound her fate to a man who saw the law as an obstacle to be overcome, not a shield to hide behind. The stage was set, the players were in place, and the air was thick with the certainty that trouble wasn't just coming. It was already there, waiting for its moment. The dream of a quiet life died hard under the relentless Texas sun. For a time, Jim Reed tried to beat his past into a plowshare, to work the stubborn soil and be the farmer Myra's family had wanted. But the land held no promise for him, and the quiet life felt more like a cage than a sanctuary. There was a restlessness in him, a hunger for the old thrill, the easy money, and the simple, brutal clarity of a fight. Myra, sharp as she was, saw it in his eyes. She saw the farmer fading and the ghost of the bushwhacker growing stronger with each passing day. The human omen arrived not as a single stranger, but as a clan. They were the Stars, a notorious Cherokee family who lived by their own laws in the wild Indian territory. When they came to visit Jim, it was like a change in the weather. They were men who moved with a different rhythm, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon, their hands never straying far from their belts. They spoke in low tones about fast horses, fat cattle that belonged to other men, and lawmen who could be outrun or outgunned. In their presence, Myra could see the change in her husband. The slump of the weary farmer left his shoulders, replaced by the coiled readiness of a predator. Their whispers and laughter late into the night sounded like a prophecy of doom to her. This wasn't the rebellion of a Southerner against the Union anymore. This was the siren song of pure outlawry, and Jim was listening with his entire soul. She must have felt a cold dread settle deep in her gut. This was the moment of decision, the fork in the road she could see as plainly as a line in the dust. She had chosen a dangerous man, hoping she could tame him, but now his world was coming to claim him back. Every clink of a whiskey bottle, every quiet cleaning of a revolver was a sign. It was the feeling of standing on a cliff edge, knowing that the man she loved was about to take a step and drag her over it with him. The time for farming was over. The quiet life in Texas didn't just fade away, it was executed. The news didn't arrive as a whisper on the wind, but as a formal warrant carrying the name of Jim Reed. And the charge wasn't for rustling a few head of cattle or running whiskey, it was for murder. A man lay dead, shot down during a dispute over money, and the law said Jim Reed was the one who killed him. The dream of the farm was over, drowned in another man's blood. For Myra, this was the moment the earth opened up beneath her feet. She was standing at a crossroads, and both paths led through hell. One path was to follow the law of the state, the same law that wore the blue uniform of the men who had killed her brother. To follow that path meant turning her back on her husband, the father of her children, and surrendering him to his enemies for judgment. In her world, that wasn't justice, it was the ultimate betrayal. The other path led deeper into the shadows. It meant choosing her clan over the law, loyalty over respectability. It meant accepting that her husband was a killer and deciding to stand by him, to protect him, to become his accomplice. There, in the harsh Texas sunlight, with the wanted poster acting as a death warrant, Myra Maybelle Reed made her choice. She chose blood. She chose her own. Her reaction wasn't fear, but a cold, hard resolve. The anger she had nursed since her brother's death now had a new focus. The law wasn't a faceless entity anymore. It was a hunter, and its prey was her husband. From that moment on, they were no longer just a family struggling to get by. They were fugitives. Every knock on the door, every stranger on the road was a potential threat. The conflict was no longer a matter of old grudges. It was an open war, a daily struggle for survival. The first drops of blood had been spilled, and they had stained her life forever. It happened on a cold February day in 1889, just 2 days before her 41st birthday. She was riding home from a neighbor's house, the path toward Younger's Bend as familiar to her as the lines on her own hand. The air was still, the winter woods quiet. The only sound was the steady rhythm of her horse's hooves on the hard-packed dirt trail. And then, that rhythm was shattered. The sound of the first shotgun blast was a physical thing, a brutal roar that ripped through the silence of the hollow. It echoed off the bare trees and sent a flock of birds screaming into the sky. Her horse, terrified, reared violently, and the saddle was suddenly, unnaturally empty. There was a pause then, just a few seconds that must have felt like an eternity, a moment of agonizing stillness. Then a second, more deliberate blast followed, its report even uglier than the first. And after that, there was only a profound, ringing silence. Later, it was the horse that brought the first news of the tragedy. It came galloping back to the cabin at Younger's Bend, wild-eyed and trembling, the reins tangled, the saddle empty. It was a message of disaster that needed no words. The men who saw it knew instantly that something terrible had happened out on that lonely trail. When they followed the horse's tracks back, they found her. She was lying at the edge of the muddy creek crossing shed, ridden through 1,000 times. The cold, grey water swirled around her, indifferent to the scene. There were no witnesses, only the churned-up mud and the chilling quiet of the woods where an assassin had hidden, waited, and vanished. Her riding habit was stained with the dark, wet earth of the creek bank. The legendary bandit queen, the woman whose name was whispered in fear and admiration from Texas to Arkansas, the friend of the James boys and the wife of Sam Starr, had not gone down in a blaze of glory. There was no grand shootout, no final defiant stand. The air still smelled of spent gunpowder. The only other evidence was the profound and terrible stillness where a life had just been. It was an execution, carried out from the shadows, a cowardly end to a life that had been anything but cowardly. The violence wasn't in the details of the wounds, it was in the deafening silence that was left behind. We will never know for certain who hid in that cold brush, but we can try to crawl inside the mind of a man who would. Let's imagine it was the prime suspect, Edgar Watson, a man with a murder warrant hanging over his head like a noose. In his mind, this wasn't an act of pure evil. It was a simple, brutal calculation. Belle Starr had become a threat to his very existence. She had discovered his secret, the crime he had run so far to escape, and she was about to turn him out. That meant the law would come sniffing around, and his life as a free man would be over. In this twisted logic, Belle wasn't a person anymore. She was a problem, a loose end that needed to be tied off permanently. He saw her not as the legendary bandit queen, but as the one person standing between him and survival. Killing her wasn't an act of passion. It was a business decision, as cold and pragmatic as shooting a lame horse. He was a cornered animal, and in his world, you did whatever it took to break out of the trap. Honor, friendship, decency, those were luxuries a man like him couldn't afford. The switch flipped the moment he realized she would not be bluffed or bought, the moment he looked into her eyes and saw that she was going to act. That was the point of transformation. His anger and fear cooled into a single, sharp point of purpose. The planning would have been methodical. He knew her routines, her paths. He would have chosen the creek crossing deliberately, a place where she would have to slow her horse, where the terrain gave him perfect cover, where the sound of the shot would be muffled by the hollow. He wasn't a raging monster. He was a patient predator setting a trap. And after the second blast tore the air, what did he feel? Not remorse, not triumph. Most likely he felt a profound and chilling sense of relief. The threat was gone. The problem was solved. As he melted back into the brush, his heart would have been beating fast, but not from guilt. It was the adrenaline of survival. His mind would already be working on the next steps. The alibi, the look of surprise on his face when he heard the news. Whether it was the cold calculation of a man like Watson, or the hot, humiliated rage of her own son, the psychology was the same. Belle had become an obstacle, and for the beast in the shadows, obstacles were meant to be removed. When the echoes of the second shot finally died, a heavy, unnatural silence fell over Younger's Bend. The discovery was as grim and undignified as the murder itself. It wasn't a posse of lawmen who found her, but her own people, led to the spot by her riderless horse. They lifted her body from the cold, clinging mud of the creek bank and carried her home. The fearsome bandit queen, the woman who had stared down Judge Parker's court, was gone. All that was left was the mortal remains of Myra Maybelle Starr, her clothes soaked and stained with the earth she had fought so hard to possess. The cabin at Younger's Bend, once a bustling sanctuary for men on the run, became a house of mourning. The whispers of outlaw plots were replaced by the stunned silence of grief. For her daughter, Pearl, the sight of her mother's body was a wound that would never heal. The shock was soon followed by a cold, burning question that settled in the air like smoke. Who had done this? And who among the men and women gathered in that very room knew more than they were saying? The fight for survival was no longer against the law. It was against the secret killer who might be standing right beside them. Word travels fast in the back country, and it wasn't long before the law arrived. Deputy marshals from Fort Smith, Judge Isaac Parker's men, rode into Younger's Bend. They were hard men, accustomed to the violence of the territory, but this was different. This was the murder of the most famous woman in their jurisdiction. They weren't just investigating a crime, they were stepping into the heart of a legend, a place built on a foundation of secrets and lies, where every neighbor had a grudge and every friend had a hidden motive. The investigation began immediately, a slow, methodical process of untangling the web of Belle's complicated life. Who were her enemies? Who owed her money? Who feared her? The list was dangerously long. A reward was posted, a paltry sum that seemed an insult to the scale of her fame. But in a land where loyalty was cheap and life was cheaper, even a small reward could be enough to loosen a tongue or point a finger. The initial chaos of rumor soon began to crystallize around one name. In the fearful whispers of neighbors and the cold calculations of the deputies, the name of Edgar Watson surfaced again and again. The tenant farmer with a secret past, the man Belle was about to evict. He had the motive, he had the opportunity, and he had the cold-blooded history. The hunt for Belle Starr's killer now had a face and a name. Belle Starr's murder was like a stone dropped into a still pond, and the ripples of fear and suspicion spread through every isolated cabin in the territory. This wasn't a tight-knit community bound by friendship. It was a loose collection of families, fugitives, and farmers, all held together by a fragile web of convenience and mutual distrust. Her death tore that web to pieces. Instantly, invisible lines were drawn in the dirt. On one side were those loyal to Belle's memory, her family, the outlaws she had sheltered, and the neighbors who had, in their own way, respected her power. On the other side were those who had feared her, owed her money, or, like Edgar Watson, felt the sting of her wrath. When the marshals from Fort Smith began their investigation, they ran headlong into a solid wall of silence. You have to understand, in the Indian Territory, the law of Judge Parker was seen as a foreign power. The real law was the local code, and that code had one simple rule: you don't talk to outsiders. To be a snitch was a death sentence, far more certain than any verdict from a jury in Fort Smith. The deputies would ask questions, and in return they would get blank stares, shrugged shoulders, and the maddeningly simple phrase, "Don't know nothing." This wasn't just loyalty to the outlaw way, it was raw, paralyzing fear. The killer was still out there. He could be the man plowing the next field over. He could be listening from the shadows at the general store. To speak a name aloud to a lawman was to invite a shotgun blast in the dark for you and your family. People who once left their doors unbarred now checked them twice. A strange horseman on the road was no longer a traveler, but a potential threat. The law offered a reward, but the killer offered a much more immediate consequence. In this atmosphere of terror, even the smallest actions became profound statements of allegiance. True courage was rare, and it was quiet. It was the neighbor woman who left a basket of cornbread on Pearl's doorstep, a silent offering of sympathy that said, "I am with you," without speaking a word. Cowardice, however, was far more common. It was the man who, when asked about Edgar Watson's whereabouts on that fateful afternoon, suddenly found a fascinating spot on the floor to stare at. It was the providing of a vague alibi, the convenient lapse in memory, the turning of a blind eye. Every person in that hollow was forced to make a choice, and most chose the side of self-preservation, burying the truth under a thick blanket of silence. The hunt for Edgar Watson wasn't a grand, sweeping posse of righteous lawmen. It was two separate hunts, running on parallel tracks of justice and revenge. On one track were the U.S. deputy marshals, methodical and official, working for Judge Parker's court. On the other, far more dangerous track, was an unofficial posse, a ghost-like band led by Belle's new husband, Jim July Starr, and likely composed of men who had called Younger's Bend a safe haven. The lawmen wanted Watson in handcuffs. Jim July and his riders wanted him in a shallow grave. The Indian Territory in winter is a merciless landscape. It's not the soaring peaks of Appalachia, but a tangled, brutal world of its own, a maze of dense thickets, frozen swamps, and red clay mud that can suck a horse down to its belly. Watson knew this land. He was a creature of its shadows. He melted into the landscape, his trail as slippery as a water moccasin in a dark creek. For days, the hunt was a frustrating ordeal against nature itself. The marshals followed procedure, while Jim July's men followed instinct, their eyes reading the land for broken twigs and disturbed leaves that the official lawmen missed. Watson was a phantom. A farmer would report seeing a man matching his description near the Poto River, but by the time the posse arrived, he was gone, leaving nothing but a cold campfire. They were always one step behind, chasing a ghost through a wilderness that seemed designed to protect its own. The territory itself was his greatest ally. It was a place where a man on the run could find a sympathetic ear, a hot meal, and a fresh horse from someone who held their own grudge against the law at Fort Smith. Watson wasn't just one man against a posse. He was a fugitive plugged into the lawless network that thrived in those hills. The chase stretched on, the days turning into a week. The pursuers grew weary, their supplies dwindling, their frustration mounting. They were hunting in a land of whispers and lies, where the very air seemed to conspire against them. It felt less like a manhunt and more like an exorcism, trying to drive a malevolent spirit out of a haunted land. Every cold night spent by a fire was a reminder that their quarry was out there, just as cold, just as determined, and driven by the most powerful engine of all, the will to survive. The end came not with a roar, but with a quiet click. It wasn't in a desperate firefight on a windswept ridge. The U.S. Marshals, relentless in their pursuit, finally cornered him. Perhaps it was a tip from someone who decided the reward money was worth more than the risk, or perhaps Watson simply made a mistake. They found him holed up, exhausted, hungry, and out of options. There was no final, defiant stand. Faced with the unwavering steel of the law, Edgar Watson surrendered. The hunt in the shadows was over, but the fight for what passed for justice in that wild country was only just beginning. The air in the Fort Smith federal courtroom was thick enough to taste, a stale mix of sweat, wet wool, and cheap tobacco. This was the domain of the hanging judge, Isaac Parker, a place where the law of the United States finally sank its teeth into the wild frontier of the Indian Territory. The trial of Edgar Watson for the murder of Belle Starr was a sensation. The public gallery was packed to the rafters with a curious and volatile mix. Sober-faced townsfolk, hard-eyed riders from the territory who watched everything with unnerving stillness, and a pack of slick reporters from the eastern papers, pencils flying, hungry for every sordid detail. Edgar Watson sat beside his lawyer, a picture of calm defiance. He wasn't a cornered, terrified animal anymore. He was clean-shaven and wore a borrowed suit, and he surveyed the courtroom with an almost imperceptible smirk. He knew the rules of this game better than any lawyer. His innocence or guilt would not be decided by facts, but by fear. He understood the code of the hills, and he was betting his life on it. The prosecution laid out its case, a carefully constructed web of circumstantial evidence. They had the motive. Bell was about to evict him, exposing him as a wanted murderer from Florida. They had the opportunity. He had no solid alibi for the time of the killing. What they didn't have was a single, credible witness. One by one, Bell's neighbors were called to the stand, and one by one, the wall of silence went up. Men who had spoken freely of their suspicions to the marshals now suffered from a crippling loss of memory. Their eyes would shift, their voices would drop to a mumble, their answers becoming a litany of, "I can't rightly say," and it was too dark to see. You can just imagine the prosecutor's mounting frustration as he watched his case dissolve under the silent, powerful gaze Watson directed at each person who took the stand. The most powerful person in that room wasn't the judge. It was the defendant. He held the lives and fears of the witnesses in his hands, and everyone knew it. They were 100 miles from their isolated cabins, but the threat felt as close as the man in the witness box. The jury was out for less than an hour. The law required them to convict beyond a reasonable doubt, and with only whispers and motive, there was doubt everywhere. The foreman stood, cleared his throat, and refused to look at Watson as he read the verdict. Not guilty. A wave of murmurs and gasps swept the room. Edgar Watson simply nodded, as if he had known the outcome all along. He stood up, a free man in the eyes of the law, and walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight. But as he passed through the crowd, a local legend says he came face to face with Bell's daughter, Pearl. Someone asked her then and there who she thought had killed her mother. Pearl, it is said, never took her eyes off Watson as she replied, her voice cold and clear, "I know who killed my mother, and so does Mr. Watson." The court of men had spoken, but out on the courthouse steps, the justice of the mountains had delivered its own chilling verdict. The verdict was a second shotgun blast, this one fired into the heart of Bell's family. For her daughter Pearl, the acquittal of Edgar Watson was an impossible betrayal. The law had failed, and the man she believed was her mother's murderer was now free to walk the same earth. She and her brother Ed were now adrift, the anchor of their chaotic world gone. They stayed at Younger's Bend for a time, trying to hold on to the last piece of their mother's legacy, but the place was haunted. Every shadow in the woods, every creak of the cabin door was a reminder of the murder and the injustice. Eventually, the weight became too much. They drifted away, their lives following a long, sad arc away from the violence of their upbringing, seeking a peace they would never fully find. As for Edgar Watson, he left Fort Smith a free man, but he was a marked man. The court's verdict meant nothing in the territory, where Bell's friends and family held their own silent court. He knew he could never return to his farm, so he fled, becoming a wanderer, drifting from state to state, always looking over his shoulder. He couldn't escape the shadow of the Bandit Queen. For years, he was a ghost, haunted by the murder he was never convicted of. The law had acquitted him, but the court of public opinion and rumor had found him guilty. His ultimate fate is a matter of legend itself, but many say he met his end years later in another squalid dispute, his life ending as violently as the one he was accused of taking. It was a different kind of justice, slow and patient, but just as final. The community around Younger's Bend tried to forget. Forgetting was a form of self-preservation. To speak of Belle Starr's murder was to stir up ghosts and invite trouble. The story was pushed down, buried under the routines of farming and the passing of seasons. The notorious cabin at Younger's Bend, the outlaw sanctuary, slowly fell into disrepair, its timbers rotting, its stories fading into the landscape. The territory was changing, The old outlaw days were dying, and the people who lived there wanted to look forward, not back. The story became a cautionary tale whispered to children, a wild piece of local folklore. They buried the truth under a conspiracy of silence, not out of malice, but out of a desperate need for peace. But burying a story like that is like burying a seed. It doesn't die. It just waits in the darkness, ready to sprout again when someone comes along and starts digging. The name Star didn't simply vanish into the red dirt of the territory. It echoed on, carried by her children, whose lives were forever shaped by their mother's violent end. Her son, Ed Reed, continued a life of petty crime, a pale shadow of the outlaws his mother had known, until he was killed in a saloon argument. Her daughter, Pearl, took a different path. She tried to escape the legacy, but found that the only way to survive was on the fringes of the very society that had sensationalized her mother's life. She eventually settled in Fort Smith and ran a bordello, becoming a different kind of outlaw queen, one who provided a haven not for gunslingers, but for the lonely and the lost. The most tangible trace of Belle Starr is a lonely patch of ground near the Eufaula Lake in modern-day Oklahoma, not far from where Younger's Bend once stood. There lies her grave. For years it was marked by a headstone said to have been carved by her daughter Pearl, bearing a bell, a star, and a poignant poem. Shed not for her the bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, the gem that filled it sparkles yet. It was a daughter's attempt to reclaim the memory of her mother, to see the gem instead of the gun smoke. But even in death, the legend wouldn't let the woman rest. Over the decades, Belle Starr's grave was desecrated, plundered by treasure hunters possessed by the dime novel lies. They came searching for the twin Colt pistols they believed were buried with her, for jewels, for anything to connect them to the myth. In 1930, ghouls stole the headstone itself. Later, they even stole what was believed to be her skull. The woman's story was consumed by her own legend, her final resting place picked apart by the very sensationalism that had created her. Today, the cabin at Younger's Bend has long since rotted back into the earth. The courthouse in Fort Smith has been preserved as a museum, its walls no longer echoing with the whispers of her trial. Most of the people who live on that land now only know her name from a road sign or a local festival. But the land remembers. The wind that whispers through the blackjack oaks still carries the story. Though the people and the buildings are gone, the spirit of that violent, defiant, and tragic life remains, a permanent echo in the soil of Oklahoma. So we come back to that cold, muddy creek, and the question that still hangs in the air like winter mist: who pulled the trigger? The law books will tell you the case is unsolved, the killer never brought to justice. But the truth, as it so often does in those hills, lies in the whispers that the court refused to hear. The real killer was likely not some romantic, spurned outlaw, but a desperate man with a dark secret, ending a squalid dispute with a blast of buckshot. A pathetic, cowardly end to a life that was anything but. But perhaps the greatest lesson from this saga isn't about solving a murder. It's about how a real person, made of flesh, blood, and contradictions, can be consumed by the legend created for her. Belle Starr was not the mastermind, the velvet-clad rider leading gangs into battle. She was a woman forged in the crucible of civil war, a survivor who used her wits and her connections to build a life in a violent world dominated by violent men. She was a haven, a negotiator, a mother, and a formidable enemy. The true tragedy of Belle Starr isn't found in the manner of her death, but in the theft of her life by the myth that outlived her. This is a story of the untamable, often brutal spirit of the American frontier, and of the sensationalist press that turned real people's pain into cheap entertainment. The newspapers and dime novels gave the world a bandit queen, but in doing so, they erased the real Myra Maybelle Shirley, who lived, bled, and died in the mud of the Indian Territory. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. They said bullets curved around him in the air. They whispered that he could melt into the mountain fog like a ghost, that he'd made a deal with the devil himself in some dark and lonely hollow. For years, the name Jacko Fraser was enough to make a child stop crying and a grown man bolt his door at night. The law called him a murderer. But the people who lived and died in these hills had another name for him: the White Devil. But how does a man become a monster? How does flesh and blood turn into a legend that haunts a landscape for 100 years? Today, we hunt for the truth behind the ghost story. To understand a man like Jacko Fraser, you first have to understand the world that made him. Imagine the Cumberland Mountains in the late 1800s on the jagged border of Virginia and Kentucky. This was a land forgotten by God and the government, a place of stunning beauty and breathtaking cruelty. The mists that clung to the hollows hid deep secrets, and the ancient hills had seen more than their share of blood and tears. The Civil War had ripped through these communities, leaving behind not just poverty, but a generation of men who had been taught that the fastest way to solve a problem was with a rifle. They came home to find their farms in ruins and their futures uncertain. The law, in this part of the world, was a distant rumor. A county sheriff might hold authority in the dusty courthouse square, but out in the winding creeks and isolated cabins, his power faded to nothing. Here, a different law held sway: the law of the clan. Family was everything. Your name was your flag. Your cousins were your army. An insult to one was an insult to all, and debts of honor were paid in blood. This was the era of the great feuds, like the Hatfields and McCoys, where violence was not just an outburst of anger, but a structured part of life, a grim inheritance passed down from father to son. This fierce loyalty was born of isolation. The dense forests and impassable ridges didn't just separate families from the outside world, they separated them from each other. Every farmstead was its own small kingdom, every cabin a fortress. Strangers were viewed with suspicion, and a man representing the government was seen as the biggest stranger of all. People here learned to rely on themselves, their kin, and their own judgment. But self-reliance couldn't always put food on the table. This was a world of grinding poverty. Families survived on what they could scratch from the rocky soil, what they could hunt in the deep woods, and what they could distill in a hidden still under the light of the moon. For a man with a quick trigger finger and no conscience, the desperation hanging in the air smelled like opportunity. It was into this boiling cauldron of pride, poverty, and clan justice that Jacko Fraser was born. The world he saw was not a place of laws and morals, but a battlefield for survival. The mountains were poised on a knife's edge, holding a fragile, violent peace. But that peace was about to be shattered, not by an invading army, but by a monster it had created in its own image. Long before the massacre that made him a legend, Jacko Fraser's name was already a poison whispered on the mountain wind. He didn't exist in a vacuum. His terror was fed by a network of lesser evils and silent supporters. Men like Henley Cox, his most notorious accomplice, were drawn to him like moths to a flame, lesser predators orbiting a greater one. And there were others, the small-time crooks who bought his stolen goods, the informants who'd trade a neighbor's whereabouts for a silver dollar or just to settle an old score. The Mullins clan, on the other hand, were the opposite of everything Jacko stood for. They were a large, well-respected family, a cornerstone of the community, which made them the perfect target for a man who wanted to prove that no one and nothing was safe. The deepest wounds in these mountains were often the oldest. Jacko himself was said to be a veteran of the Confederacy, a man who had seen the world burn and decided he liked the heat. He didn't come back from the war looking for peace. He came back carrying the war inside him, a personal battle against a world he felt had failed him. His grudge wasn't over a single plot of land or a stolen horse. His grudge was with humanity itself. He saw society as a sham, and he aimed to tear its mask off with violence. Of course, smaller, more personal grudges festered in every hollow. A card game that ended in a bitter accusation, a dispute over a property line that had been argued for generations, a family that got a little too prosperous for a neighbor's liking. These were the hidden fault lines running beneath the community. Jacko was a master at exploiting them. He understood the dark currents of envy and resentment that flowed beneath the surface of daily life, and he knew how to use them to his advantage, turning the quiet suspicions between neighbors into open fear. And so, the rumors began to spread, moving from cabin to cabin like a sickness in the air. At first, they were just unsettling stories. A peddler who was supposed to be heading through Pound Gap simply vanished. A farmer found his best mule gone, his tack shed emptied. A lone traveler would arrive at the next settlement pale and shaken, telling a story of being robbed on the trail by a man with eyes as cold and pale as a winter sky. None of these were big enough to bring the law down from the state capital, but they were carefully stacked, one on top of the other, building a foundation of dread. Every story, filtered through a dozen mouths around a dozen hearths, grew darker and more menacing. The whispers turned into a constant, low hum of anxiety that settled over the mountains. People began to look at the shadows a little longer. The sound of a horse at night was no longer a comfort, but a cause for alarm. The community was being slowly poisoned, not just by Jacko's deeds, but by the fear of what he might do next. The stage was being set for an act of violence so brutal it would turn whispered rumors into terrified screams. The year was 1892. For the Mullins clan, it was a day of prosperity. Several members of the family, including Ira Mullins, his wife, and other kinsmen, had made the long journey by wagon to the nearest town. They were returning home, their carts laden with goods, and more importantly, their pockets heavy with cash from a successful day of trading. We're talking several $100s, a staggering fortune in those mountains, enough money to set a family up for a year, or to make a desperate man do the unthinkable. Imagine the scene. A narrow mountain path, barely wide enough for their wagons, snaking its way through the dense, dark woods of Pound Gap. The late afternoon sun was beginning to fail, casting long, distorted shadows that clawed at the edges of the trail. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The steady creak of the wagon wheels and the soft plod of the horses were the only sounds in a world that was growing unnaturally quiet. The birds had stopped singing. The woods were holding their breath. It was a feeling every mountain person knows in their bones. The difference between a peaceful silence and a waiting one. Perhaps one of the men glanced nervously into the darkening trees. Perhaps a child in the wagon pulled a blanket a little tighter around their shoulders, sensing a shift in the air. They were on their own land, just miles from the safety of their homes. But that feeling of safety was beginning to fray like an old rope. They were being watched. Suddenly, from the deep shadows of the forest, a command rang out, a harsh voice slicing through the quiet, telling them to halt. But this wasn't a warning. It was a declaration. Before the echo had even died, the trees erupted in a blaze of rifle fire. The led horse screamed and reared, falling in its traces. The quiet evening was shattered by the roar of guns, the splintering of wood, and the first cries of shock and pain. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution. The point of no return had arrived, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap of violence that would stain these mountains forever. The ambush was brutally efficient. The narrow pass became a slaughter pen, a claustrophobic trap from which there was no escape. The first volley of shots sent a wave of chaos through the wagon train. It was a cacophony of terror, the sharp crack of rifles echoing off the rock walls, the splintering of wagon boards, the high-pitched screaming of wounded horses, and the raw human cries of disbelief and agony. Men who had been solid, living figures just a second before now crumpled to the ground, becoming nothing more than dark shapes in the failing light. But the attackers were not wild animals in a frenzy. They moved with a chilling purpose, emerging from the tree line like specters. Among them, One figure moved with a terrifying calm, his pale eyes scanning the wreckage with an unnerving detachment. This was not a fight. It was a harvest. As the survivors scrambled for cover that didn't exist, Jacko Fraser and his men moved in, their rifles barking with methodical precision, each shot finding its mark. Ira Mullins lay wounded in the dirt, the life seeping out of him onto the very land his family had worked for generations. A shadow fell over him. He looked up to see Jacko Fraser standing there, his face as impassive as carved stone. There was no rage in his eyes, no flicker of emotion at all. It was the cold, empty gaze of a man looking at an object, not a human being. A revolver appeared in Jacko's hand. The metallic click of its hammer being pulled back was the loudest sound in the world. Then came a single sharp report that slammed the door shut on Ira Mullins's life. With the killing done, a new and even more grotesque phase began. Jacko knelt beside the body of the man he had just executed, and with the calm demeanor of a clerk counting change, reached into his pockets and retrieved the thick roll of money. This cold ritual was repeated as the gang moved from one still form to another, their hands searching pockets and pouches. They were not just murderers, they were grave robbers, desecrating their victims before the bodies had even grown cold. When the last echo of gunfire had faded and the last coin had been pocketed, what remained was a tableau from hell. A wagon lay on its side, its contents, flour, cloth, tools, spilled across the dirt road like the entrails of a dying beast. The horses lay tangled in their harnesses, their great bodies still and silent. The air, thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood, hung heavy and motionless. It was the silence that was the worst part, a profound, deafening silence where just moments before there had been life, laughter, and hope. And as quickly as they had appeared, they were gone. Jacko and his men didn't flee in a panic. They simply stepped back into the deep woods, swallowed by the same shadows that had birthed them. It was as if the mountain itself had opened up, unleashed its demons, and then closed again, leaving behind no evidence of their passage, only the wreckage of a family and a silence that screamed. This was more than a robbery. It was more than murder. It was a statement written in blood on a lonely mountain trail. It was a declaration that there were no safe places, that the bonds of family and community were no shield against a man with a frozen heart. On that day, in the twilight of Pound Gap, John Fraser the outlaw died, and Jacko, the White Devil, was well and truly born. The silence that followed the massacre was deeper than any grave. For a time, the only witnesses were the ancient trees and the cold, unblinking stars. It was a kinsman sent out from the Mullins homestead when the wagons failed to return, who stumbled into the nightmare. He found the scene not by sound, but by its terrible stillness. The dark, hulking shape of the overturned wagon, the pale glimmer of spilled flour on the ground looking like a dusting of snow, and then the bodies, scattered among the wreckage like fallen leaves, their stillness an affront to nature itself. The cry that broke from that man's throat was a sound of pure horror, an animal howl of grief that finally shattered the unholy calm. When the news reached the Mullins family, it was like a physical blow, a shock that left them gasping for air. But in the Appalachian heart, grief is a fast-burning fire that quickly turns to iron resolve. The women's wails of sorrow echoed through the hollows, a heartbreaking chorus for the dead. But the men's faces were a different kind of terrible. Their grief was silent, their eyes hard and cold, their hands resting on the stocks of the rifles that were never far from reach. They tenderly carried their dead home, but in their hearts, they were already carrying a vow of vengeance. News in the mountains travels not on wires, but on the wind, passed from cabin to cabin in hushed, urgent whispers. The story of the Pound Gap massacre spread like a plague of fear. It confirmed every dark suspicion, every campfire ghost story. The name Jacko Fraser was no longer just a name. It was a curse, the living embodiment of every settler's deepest fear, the fear of what lurked in the untamed wilderness just beyond the light of their lanterns. Doors were bolted earlier. Men took their rifles with them to plow the fields. The comfortable darkness of the mountains, once a familiar blanket, now felt like a shroud, filled with unseen, malevolent eyes. The sheer brutality of the attack was too much to be ignored, even by the distant and often indifferent hand of the law. The murders weren't just a crime, they were an insurrection against the very idea of society. The authorities in both Virginia and Kentucky, pressured by the influential families and a terrified populace, were finally prodded awake. A substantial reward was offered for the capture of Jacko Fraser and his gang, a fortune that could make a poor man rich for life. The notice was nailed to the courthouse doors and the sides of general stores, turning the ghost into a wanted man with a price on his head. The bodies of the Mullins family were laid to rest in the cold mountain earth, but their story refused to be buried. The massacre became a line drawn in the dirt. On one side was the world of families, faith, and hard work. On the other was Jacko Fraser. He was no longer just an outlaw. He was the White Devil, a figure of folklore born from a real-world atrocity. The hunt was now not just a matter of law, but a crusade. The question was, how do you hunt a man who is already a ghost? The bounty posters were barely dry before the hunt began. This was not going to be a simple posse of local farmers. The states of Virginia and Kentucky marshaled their forces, calling in the best they had. They hired professional detectives from the famed Baldwin Felts agency, outsiders with city methods and a reputation for ruthlessness. But the man chosen to lead the hunt was a legend in his own right, Marshal Big Ed Hall. He was a man cast from the same mountain rock as Jacko, who knew every secret trail and hidden hollow. He was Jacko's opposite, a man of the mountains who had chosen the badge over the outlaw's gun. And alongside the lawmen and hired guns rode men with faces like stone. They were the kin of the murdered Mullins family. They weren't there for the reward money. They were there to settle a family score, and their justice wasn't written in any law book. Hunting Jacko Fraser in the Cumberland Mountains was like trying to catch a whisper in the wind. He was in his element, a predator on his home ground. The very landscape that the posse found so punishing was his greatest ally. The mountains that had cradled him now conspired to hide him. For weeks, they combed the ridges and ravines, a grueling ordeal of cold nights and false trails. The posse would find the embers of a campfire still warm, or a footprint in the mud of a creek bed, only to have the trail vanish into thin air. It was as if Jacko could simply dissolve into the mist. The mountains that had once been a home to the posse members had now become a deadly labyrinth, and in its center lurked a monster who knew every turn. The posse grew weary, their resolve frayed by frustration and the constant, unnerving feeling of being watched. They knew Jacko was out there, seeing them long before they saw him. Every rustle in the undergrowth could be an ambush, every shadowy rock formation a sniper's nest. But in the end, it wasn't a tracker's skill or a detective's logic that cornered the White Devil. It was human weakness. A name was whispered to the lawmen. An informant, tempted by the life-changing reward or simply terrified into submission, gave up Jacko's hiding place. The mountain's code of silence had finally been broken by the one thing stronger than loyalty: fear. The tip-off led them to a lonely, isolated cabin near the Kentucky border. They surrounded it in the dead of night, a ring of steel closing in under a moonless sky. As the first grey light of dawn touched the peaks, Big Ed Hall gave the signal. The quiet morning was torn apart by a final desperate volley of gunfire as Jacko tried to fight his way out. But it was hopeless. He was one man against a small army. When they dragged him out into the light, blinking and bloodied, the posse members steeled themselves, expecting to see a demon. Instead, they saw a man. His clothes were ragged, his body weary from weeks on the run, but his eyes... His eyes were the same. In their icy depths, there was no fear, no regret, not even anger. There was only a profound, chilling emptiness, and the bottomless exhaustion of a man who knows his road has come to an end. For the lawmen, it was the end of a manhunt. But for the Mullins kin who stood there, watching the man who had destroyed their world, the look in their eyes said that true justice had not yet begun. The arrest of the White Devil was a sensation. His trial in Wise, Virginia, was a pilgrimage. People came from 3 states, on foot, on horseback, and in wagons, clogging the dusty streets of the small county seat. They weren't there to see justice done. They were there to see the monster in a cage. The courthouse stood under the watchful eye of armed guards, its lawn transformed into a sprawling camp of onlookers. The air buzzed with a carnival-like energy, a strange mix of grim satisfaction and morbid curiosity. This wasn't a legal proceeding, it was a public exorcism. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick enough to choke on. Every bench was crammed, with men standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The judge, the lawyers with their starched collars, the 12 men in the jury box, they were all part of a system trying to impose its formal logic on a story of primal savagery. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Their voices trembled with a mixture of grief and lingering fear as they recounted the horrors of that evening in Pound Gap. They pointed trembling fingers at the man sitting at the defendant's table, and Jacko Fraser just sat there. He showed no remorse, no fear, not even a flicker of interest. As survivors wept on the stand, he watched them with the same detached curiosity a man might watch a bug crawling across a windowsill. His silence was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. He was a void, a black hole of human feeling in the center of the room, and his cold, defiant calm was his final weapon. He refused to play their game, refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing him break. He was a monster, and he seemed content to let them know it. The trial was, as everyone knew it would be, a formality. The evidence was absolute, the testimony unshakable. When the jury filed back in, their faces were grim and set. The foreman didn't need to clear his throat. His voice was steady and clear as he pronounced the single word that everyone had come to hear: guilty. A collective sigh, a wave of relief and whispered approval washed over the courtroom. The judge, his voice heavy with the weight of his duty, sentenced John Jacko Fraser to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. The law of men had spoken. But as the crowd spilled back out into the sunlight, a question hung in the air, unspoken but felt by every person who called these mountains home. Was this justice? A clean, quick, state-sanctioned death on a gallows? Did that truly pay the debt for the ambush in Pound Gap, for the cold-blooded murder of men in front of their families? The law had delivered a verdict, a neat and tidy conclusion. But the justice of the mountains, the old law of blood for blood, demanded something more. It demanded an ending as brutal as the beginning. The court had provided a legal answer, but the people were still waiting for a final moral one. On September 15, 1893, a trapdoor opened in Wise, Virginia, and the physical life of Jacko Fraser came to an end. They say a great sigh of relief swept through the crowd, as if a poison had finally been purged from the air. He was buried in an unmarked grave, a common fate for notorious outlaws, to prevent his final resting place from becoming either a shrine or a site of desecration. The earth simply swallowed its monster, leaving no stone to mark his passage. The man was gone, but his ghost was just beginning to walk. The story of the Mullins family did not end in that dusty pass. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and did what mountain people have always done: they endured. Their family line continued, a testament to a resilience far stronger than Jacko's nihilistic rage. Today, their descendants still live in those hills, carrying the memory of the massacre not as a chilling legend, but as a deep and painful part of their family history. Their names are carved in stone in old family cemeteries. The date of their death, a permanent, silent, and defiant answer to the violence that tried to erase them. The world has changed dramatically since that bloody evening. A modern highway, US Route 23, now carves a smooth paved path through Pound Gap. You can drive through the very spot where the ambush happened at 70 miles an hour, listening to the radio, your mind a million miles away. But if you pull over to the side of the road, cut the engine and listen, the modern world falls away. The woods are just as deep, the shadows just as long. In the quiet, you can almost feel the weight of that terrible silence from so long ago. The old courthouse in Wise still stands, a brick-and-mortar witness that has held the story within its walls for over a century. And of course, there is the legend of the treasure. Like all famous outlaws, Jacko was rumored to have stashed his ill-gotten fortune, thousands of dollars in gold and silver coin, somewhere in the labyrinthine caves and crevices of the Cumberland Mountains. For decades after his death, treasure hunters, armed with old maps and older rumors, dug into the hillsides, chasing the ghost's promise of cursed gold. The treasure was never found, of course, but the hunt itself became a part of the story, keeping the White Devil's name alive, a whisper of greed and danger that echoed through the generations. Most people have forgotten the facts of the case. The official records are yellowed and brittle, gathering dust in courthouse archives. But the mountains have a long memory. The name Jacko Fraser still surfaces from time to in these parts, a dark ballad told around a late-night fire. He is no longer a man of flesh and blood, but a piece of the landscape itself, a warning, a folk tale, a permanent shadow that time has not been able to erase. So we return to the question we asked at the very beginning. How does a man become a monster? The story of Jacko Fraser gives us a chilling answer. He wasn't born a demon. He was forged in the fires of a brutal war and hammered into shape on the anvil of a lawless, desperate land. He was the ultimate consequence of a world where civilization was a distant rumor and survival was a daily battle. The White Devil wasn't a supernatural force. He was something far more terrifying, a man who had shed every last piece of his humanity and embraced the darkness that waits inside us all. And how does a monster become a legend? His cruelty was so absolute, so far beyond the normal feuds and fights of the mountains, that people had to make him more than a man to understand him. It was easier to believe he was a ghost who could melt into the fog, a demon who had made a pact with Satan, than to accept the horrifying truth, that a human being, a man of flesh and blood, could be capable of such cold, empty evil. The legend of Jacko Fraser wasn't just a story told to frighten children. It was a story adults told themselves to make sense of the senseless. This isn't just a tale of true crime. It's a parable etched into the very rock of these mountains. It is a story of the terrible beauty and brutal reality of the Appalachian frontier. It reminds us that for every hero there is a shadow, and that the history of this place is written in both courage and in blood. Jacko Fraser was more than a murderer. He was the living embodiment of the mountain people's deepest, darkest fear, the fear of what lurks in the shadows just beyond your own doorstep. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. The rope was already around his neck. On May 1st, 1868, Tom Dooley looked out over the crowd and with his last breath spoke the words that would seal a woman's reputation in darkness for eternity. He said, "If it wasn't for Ann Melton, I wouldn't be on this scaffold today." Was it a damning accusation? A confession of his own weakness? Or the last, desperate act of a man protecting the woman he truly loved? We all know the song about the hanged man and his dead lover, Laura Foster. But the legend has a third name, a shadow at its heart. Today, we separate the ballad from the bitter truth to answer one question. Was the true monster in this story the one who walked away free? To understand the blood that was spilled, you first have to understand the soil it stained. This was Wilkes County, North Carolina, in the year 1866. The air in these mountains still tasted of gunpowder and defeat. The Civil War had bled the hollows dry, sending its sons home not as conquering heroes, but as ghosts. Men returned to find their farms overgrown, their families gaunt with poverty, and a silence in the valleys that felt heavier than before. Life was a stubborn, grinding affair, measured by the seasons and the sweat of your brow. It was a world of hard work, quiet faith, and passions that, once stirred, ran deeper and faster than any mountain creek. Into this world walked Thomas Dooler, known to everyone as Tom Dooley. Before the war, he was the boy with the quick smile and the fiddle that could make the devil himself tap his feet. But the Tom who came back was different. He'd survived the living hell of Point Lookout prison camp, and the experience had burned something out of him, replacing it with a reckless charm and a darkness in his eyes. He still played the fiddle, but now the tunes seemed wilder, more desperate, as if he was trying to drown out memories that followed him from the battlefield. At the unshakable center of Tom's world was Anne Pauline Melton. She was Laura Foster's cousin, married to a quiet farmer named James Melton, a man who seemed to exist only in her shadow. Anne was not just beautiful, she was a force of nature. With dark, knowing eyes and a will as strong as iron, she was a woman who refused to be contained by the small, pious world she inhabited. Her affair with Tom Dooley was the worst-kept secret in Elkville, a blazing fire that everyone saw, but no one dared try to put out. It was a passion born long before the war, and it had only intensified upon his return. And then there was Laura Foster, younger, fairer, and by all accounts of a gentler nature than her cousin Anne. She was a girl on the cusp of womanhood, with dreams that were likely as simple as they were sincere: to be courted, to be married, to build a life. She, too, fell under the spell of the handsome, haunted fiddle player. In her, Tom perhaps saw a chance at a different kind of life, a peace he could never find with the tempestuous Anne. For a time, this fragile, dangerous balance held. Life went on. James Melton ploughed his fields, pretending not to know. The community whispered behind their hands at church and at the general store. Anne held court, the queen of a tiny, isolated kingdom, with Tom as her devoted, reckless knight. And Laura Foster watched from the edges, her heart full of a hope that was about to turn deadly. They were all caught in a web of love, jealousy, and obligation, unaware that the world they knew was about to be burned to the ground. But the war had sent home more than just broken men. It sent home a sickness, a blood taint that traveled in silence. It was an unseen enemy, carried in the veins of a soldier, that would soon become the catalyst for an act of brutality that would leave these mountains forever scarred. The storm was coming, and no one even saw the clouds gathering. The Fosters, the Meltons, the Doolers, these were not new names in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Their roots ran as deep as the ancient oaks, clinging to the rocky soil for generations. They were descendants of the first Scots, Irish, and English settlers who pushed into these wild, unforgiving hollows in the late 1700s. They came seeking land of their own and a life free from the meddling of kings and governments. They fought the wilderness, they fought the natives, and sometimes they fought each other to hold on to the small plots of earth that defined their existence. This land wasn't just property, it was a testament to survival paid for in sweat and blood. Every creek, every ridge, every dark stand of timber was tied to a story, a birth, a death, a memory. But history had left scars on this land that had never truly healed. The Civil War was the deepest of them all. Wilkes County had been a place torn in two. While many men like Tom Dooler marched off to fight for the Confederacy, the hills were also crawling with Union sympathizers, draft dodgers, and outright deserters. It was a war fought not just on distant battlefields, but in hushed conversations and suspicious glances between neighbors. Loyalty became a currency more valuable than gold, and betrayal was a poison that could linger in a family's well for 50 years. When the war ended, it didn't bring peace. It brought a simmering resentment. The men who came back, like Tom, were changed, and the community they returned to was fractured. The old order was shattered, and the law was often little more than a suggestion. In this power vacuum, the oldest laws of the mountains reasserted themselves, the laws of clan and kin. And in this world, a name was a heavy thing to carry. To be a foster in these hills meant something. It meant you were part of a sprawling, tangled web of blood relations. You were never truly alone, but you were never truly free either. Your triumphs and your shames belonged to the whole family. An insult to one foster was an insult to all, and the family's honor had to be protected at any cost. This wasn't just about pride, it was about survival. A family with a stained reputation was a weak family, vulnerable to its enemies. The weight of that name and the secrets it had to protect was a burden every foster, including Anne and Laura, carried from the day they were born. In a place like Wilkes County, news traveled faster on foot than it did by post. The general store, the churchyard, the grist mill, these were the arenas where reputations were built and destroyed. And at the center of this web of whispers was Anne Melton. Her affair with Tom Dooley wasn't just a private sin. It was a public spectacle, a long-running drama the entire community followed with a mix of condemnation and fascination. Every glance between them, every time he lingered too long at her farm, was noted, dissected, and woven into the local law. The supporting cast was a complex gallery of cousins and neighbors, each with their own loyalties and resentments. There was Pauline Foster, another cousin, a woman who moved through the community with watchful eyes. The exact nature of her relationship with Anne is lost to history, but the court records would later suggest a deep-seated animosity, the kind that festers between women who are too much alike or who have vied for the same things. Then there were the Meltons, James's family, who had to endure the shame of his wife's open infidelity. And there was James himself, a quiet, brooding figure. The community saw him as a cuckold, a weak man who couldn't control his wife. But was his silence weakness, or was it the coiled patience of a man nursing a deep and bitter wound? The affair itself was the great, unhealed sore on the community's skin. It was an affront to the sacred institution of marriage and a constant source of tension. But there were other, smaller slights that kept the air poisoned. A harsh word exchanged at a quilting bee, a dispute over a stray hog, the natural jealousies that arise when one family does slightly better than another. In these isolated hollows, such grievances weren't easily forgotten. They were collected like debts, passed down through whispers, waiting for a moment to be called due. The Foster clan was so large and interwoven that it was a world unto itself, rife with its own internal rivalries and power struggles. It was this fertile ground of gossip and resentment that allowed the most dangerous rumor of all to take root. When whispers of the foul disease began to circulate, they fell on ready ears. Syphilis was more than an illness. It was a mark of moral decay, a physical manifestation of sin. The rumor transformed the affair from a simple matter of adultery into something dark and terrifying. It was a secret that, if exposed, would bring a level of shame and ruin that was absolute. It wouldn't just be whispers, it would be utter damnation. The air in Elkville grew thick and heavy. Anne, Tom, and Laura were no longer just three people caught in a tangle of passion. They were characters in a tragedy that everyone was watching unfold, a tragedy being written in real time by the relentless, unforgiving murmur of the community. The pressure was immense. Every smile felt like a mask, every conversation like an interrogation. The stage was set, and the ground was soaked with the fuel of old grudges, just waiting for a single spark to set the whole world ablaze. In the mountains, people have always paid attention to signs. They knew how to read the sky for a coming storm, and they knew how to read the woods for omens. And in the spring of 1866, the old folks would later claim the signs were all bad. They said the whippoorwills called too close to the houses, a sure sign of a soul about to depart. A strange, unnatural quiet seemed to settle in the hollows, a silence that felt sharp and heavy in the air, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, waiting for a coming violence. These were the whispers of the woods, the ancient language of dread that every mountain person understood in their bones. The true omen, however, was not a bird or a dream. It was a human one. It was the change that came over Laura Foster. The young, hopeful girl disappeared, replaced by a woman who had been handed a death sentence. When Laura learned she was sick and understood the shameful truth of how she'd gotten that way, the desperation must have been absolute. She was no longer just a spurned lover. She was a victim facing a slow, ugly decay. And she was not going to suffer that fate alone and in silence. Her threat to expose Tom, and by extension the married Anne Melton, was not the blackmail of a schemer. It was the last, defiant cry of a girl whose life had been ruined. That cry was a prophecy, and it spelled doom for Anne. Anne Melton would have felt it most of all. She was too sharp, too aware, not to see the abyss opening up before her. The whispers of the community were no longer just background noise. They were the sound of a trap being sprung. The easy power she held over men, the carefully constructed life she had built with her husband James, the fragile respectability she clung to, it was all about to be consumed by scandal and disease. She must have felt a cold knot of dread in her stomach that never went away, a premonition that the poison that had entered their lives had finally reached the heart. The walls of her world were groaning, and she knew that soon they would either come crashing down on top of her, or she would have to tear down someone else's first. The dam of whispers and threats was about to break. On a bright May morning, Laura Foster made her move. She walked out of her family's home, went to the barn, and saddled her father's mare. She told her family she was leaving to elope with Tom Dooley. This was it. This was the final desperate gamble of a girl who had nothing left to lose. It was not just a flight of romantic fancy, it was a public declaration, an act of defiance that would force every secret out into the sunlight. By riding away to meet Tom, she was setting the entire fragile world on fire. For Tom Dooley, this was the moment of reckoning. He was caught between two worlds, between the fiery, possessive love of Anne and the desperate, righteous claim of Laura. He had made promises to both. Now, Laura was calling in his debt. He had to meet her. He had to face the consequences of his actions. We'll never know what was in his heart on that day, true love for Laura, a sense of duty, or the fear of a man being led into a trap. But we know he went to the rendezvous. His fatal indecision, his inability to untangle the web he had woven, placed him squarely on the path to that shallow grave. The news of Laura's departure must have struck Anne Melton like a physical blow. The threat was no longer a possibility whispered in the dark. It was a girl on a horse, riding to destroy her. Laura's elopement with Tom would be the final, unforgivable humiliation. The whole sordid story, the affair, the lies, and the shameful disease would be laid bare for the entire county to see. The life Anne had so fiercely protected was about to be torn to shreds. The time for talk was over. The time for manipulation and quiet threats had passed. A choice had to be made right there on that spring morning. And so, the first drops of blood were shed, not with a blade, but with a decision. The plan, whether hatched in a moment of panicked rage or cold calculation, was set in motion. The rendezvous between Tom and Laura was no longer a meeting of lovers. It was an ambush. The conflict escalated from a bitter personal feud into a conspiracy to commit murder. Someone, Anne or Tom under her influence, decided that the only way to silence Laura Foster forever was to put her in the ground. As Laura rode away, the sun warm on her back, she must have felt a mix of terror and hope. She was leaving everything she had ever known behind, riding toward an uncertain future with the man she loved. She didn't know that she was not riding toward a new life. She was riding into a silence that had been carefully prepared for her, a silence as deep and final as the Appalachian earth itself. The point of no return had been crossed. The spot where Laura Foster drew rein on her father's mare was quiet and secluded. Sunlight filtered through the new spring leaves, dappling the forest floor. This was the place where her future was supposed to begin. She looked for Tom, her heart a frantic mix of hope and fear. But the figure, or figures, that emerged from the shadows of the rhododendron thicket did not offer the embrace she was expecting. We will never know the exact words that were spoken in those final moments. Was it a plea, an accusation, a bitter, venomous argument? Whatever was said, the hope in Laura's eyes must have died in an instant, replaced by the cold, stark terror of betrayal. There was no long, drawn-out scream to echo through the hollow. The violence was too sudden, too brutally intimate for that. There was likely just a sharp, choked gasp, the sound of a frantic, brief struggle in the dry leaves on the forest floor, and then a heavy, sickening thud. A sound of such finality that it seemed to drain all the life from the air around it. The sound of a life being abruptly, horribly extinguished. The world did not stop. It simply went on without her in it. The mare, panicked by the scent of terror and the sudden chaos, reared back, its eyes wide with fright. It tore through the underbrush, reins flying, the empty saddle a stark and terrible testament to what had just occurred. The horse ran without stopping, a mindless flight back toward the familiar scent of home, leaving behind a scene of unnatural stillness. A small piece of a woman's life, a bonnet perhaps, or a ribbon, lay trampled in the dirt, the only splash of color in a world that had suddenly gone gray. Then the grim work began. The silence was broken not by cries or laments, but by the rhythmic, labored sound of digging. It was the scrape and clank of a tool, a shovel or a mattock, striking the hard, unforgiving Appalachian earth. It was a desperate, sweating labor, a race against the setting sun and the possibility of a chance wanderer. Each shovelful of dirt was not just soil being moved, it was an act of concealment, an attempt to erase a person, to bury a terrible secret so deep that it might never be found. The grave was shallow, dug with the frantic haste of those who wanted to be gone from that cursed place. There was no reverence, no ceremony. The burden of Laura's body, now just a thing to be hidden, was placed into the shallow trench. The sounds were muted and awful. The rustle of her homespun dress against the dirt, the dull weight of her form settling into the earth. It was a final, profound act of desecration. Then came the final sounds, the soft, heavy thuds of dirt being shoveled back into the hole, covering the last evidence of the crime. The person, or people, who stood there in the fading light, their clothes stained with soil and their lungs burning from the effort, were not just burying a body. They were burying a promise, a future, and a piece of their own souls. When they were finished, they tried to make it look as though nothing had happened. They scattered leaves over the freshly turned earth and arranged the branches just so. But the ground was wounded. No human eyes had witnessed the act, but the ancient trees stood as silent sentinels. The mountains had seen it all, and in the Blue Ridge, the mountains never, ever forget. To understand what happened in that secluded glade, you have to try, for a moment, to look at the world through Anne Melton's eyes. In her mind, Laura Foster was no longer a person. She wasn't her cousin. She wasn't a romantic rival. She was a disease, a walking plague that threatened to consume everything Anne had built. The syphilis rumor was a death sentence, not just for the body, but for the soul. It meant being cast out, shunned, left to rot in shame while the community whispered about your sins. Laura's threat to expose it all wasn't just blackmail, it was a promise of total annihilation. From Anne's perspective, this was not a matter of jealousy over Tom Dooley. This was a matter of survival, as primal and as ruthless as a cornered animal protecting its den. The twisted logic was terrifyingly simple. You cut out the infection before it kills you. The switch flipped the moment word reached her that Laura was on that mare, riding to meet Tom. Before that, the threat was a possibility, a problem that could perhaps be managed with manipulation or intimidation. But Laura on that horse was a lit fuse burning down to the powder keg. It was an act of open war. In that instant, all other options vanished. The cool, calculating part of Anne's mind, the part that had allowed her to manage an affair under her husband's nose and maintain her standing in the community, would have taken over completely. It was no longer a messy human drama. It was a cold, hard equation. Her life, her home, her name, or Laura's. There was no room for both. So when she confronted Laura in the woods, if indeed she was the one who did, it was likely not with the explosive rage of a jealous lover. It would have been with the chilling focus of an executioner. Each step, each word, each action would have been deliberate. She would have looked at Laura and seen not the face of a frightened girl, but the embodiment of her own destruction. The act itself would have been a task to be completed, a problem to be solved. This profound, terrifying detachment is the only thing that can explain the icy composure she displayed later. It wasn't the absence of feeling, it was the absolute suppression of it in the service of a single, overriding goal, self-preservation at any cost. And in the immediate aftermath, standing there in the silence of the woods, what would she have felt? Not guilt, not remorse. That would come later, perhaps, in the dark of night when the ghosts of memory came calling. No, in that moment, she would have felt a profound and chilling relief. The threat was gone. The voice was silenced. The secret was safe, buried under 6 feet of Appalachian dirt. She had faced absolute ruin and had stared it down. She had won. It was a victory that would poison her life and damn her name for all time. But as she walked away from that shallow grave, it was a victory nonetheless. The first sign that the world had broken was the sight of a horse. Wilson Foster's mare came trotting back to the farm late that afternoon, alone. Its coat was slick with sweat and streaked with mud. Its eyes were wild with a terror it couldn't speak. The empty saddle was a screaming accusation. A father's heart knows a specific kind of cold dread, and as Wilson Foster caught the reins of the panicked animal, that coldness flooded his veins. The story of an elopement suddenly felt like a lie, a thin blanket thrown over a horrible truth. In the days that followed, Wilson and his family scoured the woods. Their calls of Laura echoed through the hollows, answered only by the cawing of crows. The search was a frantic, desperate ritual. The woods that had been Laura's playground now felt like a tomb, each shadow seeming to hold a terrible secret. The community watched, and for a time they held on to the simpler explanation. They whispered that she had run off, that she and Tom were likely halfway to Tennessee by now. It was easier to believe in a reckless girl than a dead one. This casual dismissal left the Foster family isolated in their growing nightmare. Meanwhile, the main players in the drama had scattered. Tom Dooley had vanished. One day he was a fixture in the community, the next he was gone, his absence a thunderous confession of guilt. But Anne Melton was right where she had always been. She went about her daily chores on the Melton farm, a picture of domestic calm. When questioned, her face was a mask of innocence and concern. She knew nothing. She had seen nothing. Her icy composure was a wall that no one could breach, and it was, in its own way, more terrifying than Tom's flight. Weeks turned into a long, agonizing summer. The search parties grew smaller as hope withered on the vine. Laura Foster was now officially a missing person, a ghost story whispered around the supper table. But her family, particularly her father, refused to let the silence win. They kept looking, kept asking questions, their grief hardening into a grim resolve to find the truth, no matter how ugly it might be. The whispers in the community began to change, the simple story of elopement giving way to darker suspicions of foul play. The discovery, when it finally came, was a grim and heartbreaking affair. A man named Colonel James Grayson, a local justice of the peace and a friend of the Fosters, was led to a spot deep in the woods. There, under a thin covering of leaves and branches, he saw what he had been dreading for months, a patch of earth that was too soft, too new. He began to dig. It didn't take long to uncover the horror. The search was over. Laura Foster had been found. The news ripped through Wilkes County like a flash flood. The whispers became a roar of outrage. With the discovery of the body, a missing persons case became a murder investigation. The law, which had been passive for months, was now spurred into action. The full weight of suspicion fell squarely on the man who had run. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Thomas C. Dooley. A reward was posted for his capture. Tom Dooley was no longer just a reckless local boy. He was a wanted murderer, and the hunt was on. The discovery of Laura's body was like a rock thrown into a still pond, and the ripples of suspicion and fear spread to every last cabin in the county. The comfortable lie of elopement was shattered, and in its place, a terrible truth took root. A murder had been committed. One of their own had been put in the ground like an animal, and now everyone had to choose a side. The general store was no longer a place for idle gossip. It was a courtroom where theories were argued in hushed, angry tones. At church, families who had worshipped together for generations now sat on opposite sides of the aisle, their prayers heavy with judgment for their neighbors. A thick, suffocating fear settled over the community. This wasn't a crime committed by some nameless drifter. The killer, everyone knew, was still among them. Many people must have known pieces of the truth. They'd seen Tom and Ann arguing. They'd heard the rumors about the disease. Perhaps someone had even seen Ann returning home that fateful night, her dress soiled with mud and secrets. But the Foster clan was a sprawling, powerful entity, and Ann Melton, with her iron will and piercing gaze, was a terrifying woman to cross. To speak against her was to risk more than just a cold shoulder. It was to invite a feud, to put your own family and livelihood in jeopardy. And so, a conspiracy of silence was born, not of loyalty to a killer, but out of raw, primal fear. Still, the community was not a monolith. While many pointed the finger at the fugitive Tom Dooley, others whispered that he was just a fool, a pawn in a game played by a much more cunning mind. They looked at Ann Melton, saw her cold defiance, and came to their own conclusions. They saw a woman capable of anything, a woman who had bewitched both her husband and her lover, a woman who would stop at nothing to protect her name. Tom, they argued, might have helped dig the grave, but it was Ann's venom that had struck the fatal blow. In this poisoned atmosphere, small acts of courage and cowardice became monumental. There was the quiet neighbor who, risking the wrath of the Meltons, brought a basket of food to Laura's grieving family, a silent gesture of solidarity. There was the witness, Pauline Foster, who, whether out of a sense of justice or personal spite, decided to break the silence and tell the authorities what she claimed Ann had confessed. And on the other side, there were those who provided false alibis, who swore they'd seen Tom miles away when the murder occurred, weaving a web of lies to protect a friend or simply to avoid getting involved. The murder of Laura Foster had done more than kill a young woman. It had ripped the soul out of the community. Neighbor now looked at neighbor with suspicion. Old friendships curdled into resentment. The valley was no longer a place of shared hardship and trust. It was a fractured landscape of fear, secrets, and unspoken accusations. The lines had been drawn in the dirt, and the blood that had been spilled would stain them forever. The manhunt for Tom Dooley was not just a matter of law, it was a matter of pride. Sheriff William Dooley, a relative of Tom's, was tasked with bringing him in, a duty that must have weighed on him like a shroud. But the official posse was swelled by harder men men from the Foster clan whose faces were grim masks of determination. They weren't interested in a trial, they were interested in mountain justice, a swift and final accounting for the blood of their kin. They knew Tom, they knew his habits, and they knew the woods as well as he did. They weren't just chasing a killer, they were hunting a ghost who knew every shadow in their own backyard. For weeks, Tom was a phantom. He was a creature of these mountains, born and raised in their embrace, and now he used them as his shield. He moved by night, sleeping in caves and abandoned cabins, living off whatever he could forage or steal. The posse would find his tracks by a creek bed, only to have them vanish on the hard rock upstream. They'd get a tip that he was hiding in a certain hollow, and by the time they'd surrounded it, he was already miles away, watching their lanterns flicker from a distant ridge. The rhododendron thickets, so dense they were called laurel hells, were his fortress. He was making fools of them, and with every passing day, the legend of his cunning grew, while the frustration of the hunters curdled into a cold, patient rage. But Tom knew Wilkes County was a cage, and the walls were closing in. He couldn't run forever in a place where every face knew his name. His only hope was to disappear completely, to cross the Blue Ridge into Tennessee and start a new life under a new name. And so began the second, more desperate phase of the chase. He pushed westward into the wild heart of the mountains that separated the two states. This was a brutal, unforgiving wilderness, a vertical world of razorback ridges and sunless valleys. The hunt became an ordeal of endurance, a battle against not just a man, but against the mountains themselves. The posse, relentless and driven, stayed on his trail. They followed broken twigs, faint footprints in the mud, and the whispers of isolated mountain folk who had seen a haunted-looking stranger passing through. The chase stretched on, a slow, grueling pursuit through some of the most difficult terrain in the eastern United States. Tom was starving, exhausted, and the ever-present fear of the men behind him was a constant, gnawing companion. The freedom he had run for now felt like a different kind of prison, a cold and lonely one. He finally made it to Trade, Tennessee, a small settlement just across the state line. He was no longer Tom Dooley, the fiddle-playing charmer. He was just another ragged farmhand, calling himself Tom Hall, looking for work to fill his empty belly. He found it on the farm of a man named Colonel James C. Grayson. For a brief moment, he might have thought he had made it. He was anonymous. He was safe. But the posse had its own network, and word of a suspicious newcomer who fit Tom's description had trickled back across the mountains. The moment of capture was not a blaze of gunfire on a rocky cliffside. It was quiet, pathetic, and inevitable. The posse found him helping with the chores, his shoulders slumped with weariness. He looked up and saw the familiar hard faces from home, and in that instant, he knew the running was done. The fight had gone out of him. There was no struggle, no last defiant stand. There was only the quiet resignation of a man who had been hunted to the point of collapse. He surrendered without a word, exhausted and cornered, the great chase ending not with a bang, but with the click of iron shackles. The journey back to Wilkes County was a somber procession, the hunters bringing their quarry home to face the justice of men. The trial of Tom Dooley was the greatest spectacle Wilkes County had ever seen. The small town of Statesville, where the trial was moved to avoid the inflamed passions of the locals, swelled with spectators. Farmers in dusty overalls stood shoulder to shoulder with men in fine suits, all of them craning their necks for a glimpse of the infamous killer and the woman at the center of the storm. The courtroom was a tinderbox. Armed deputies stood guard at the doors, their eyes scanning the crowd, wary of the foster kin who were there to see justice done one way or another. Tom Dooley, gaunt and broken from his time on the run, looked like a condemned man from the moment he walked in. His defense was led by Zebulon Vance, a former governor of North Carolina and one of the most brilliant lawyers in the state. Vance argued passionately that the evidence against his client was purely circumstantial, a flimsy case built on rumor and the hysteria of a community desperate for a scapegoat. But the star witness, the one everyone had come to see, was Anne Melton. When she took the stand, a hush fell over the courtroom. She was a vision of composure, her dark eyes sweeping over the crowd without a flicker of fear. She answered the prosecutor's questions with a cool, unshakable calm, denying everything. Her voice never wavered. She painted herself as a victim of malicious gossip, a respectable married woman whose name had been unfairly dragged through the mud. It was a masterful performance. To her supporters, she was a woman of incredible strength, unjustly accused. To her detractors, her icy demeanor was the ultimate proof of a sociopathic heart, a woman capable of orchestrating a murder and then lying about it without blinking. The trial was a parade of neighbors and cousins, their testimonies a tangled mess of personal grudges and second-hand stories. Pauline Foster delivered her damning testimony, claiming Anne had confessed the murder to her. But under the sharp cross-examination of Governor Vance, her credibility crumbled. She was portrayed as a spiteful woman, driven by jealousy and a personal vendetta against Anne. The case against Anne was built on a foundation of sand, one person's word against another's, with no hard evidence to tie her to the crime. In the end, the law of men, with its strict rules of evidence, could not convict her. The jury, faced with a mountain of innuendo but not a single piece of concrete proof, acquitted Anne Melton. A gasp went through the courtroom. She had walked into the heart of the fire and emerged without so much as the smell of smoke on her. She stood, smoothed her dress, and walked out of the courtroom a free woman, past the stunned and hateful glares of the Foster family. For Tom Dooley, there was no such escape. The evidence of his flight, his affair with Laura, and his presence near the scene was enough. He was found guilty and sentenced to hang. Justice had been delivered, but to many in that courtroom and in the hollows back home, it felt like a grotesque mockery. They had hanged the fool, but the mastermind, the true author of the crime, had just walked out the front door, free to return to her life as if nothing had ever happened. Was this the law of men? Or was it proof that some people were so cunning they could outwit justice itself? The thud of the trapdoor beneath Tom Dooley's feet was the final brutal punctuation mark on his life. With his death, the law was satisfied. But his last words from the gallows did not fade into the air. They hung over the hollows, a permanent stain on Anne Melton's name, a curse delivered with a dying man's breath. The trial was over, but the verdict of the mountains had just begun. For the Foster family, life became a long, quiet exercise in grief. They had a grave to tend now, a permanent scar on their land and on their hearts. But there was no closure. Every trip to the general store, every Sunday at church, held the possibility of seeing her, Anne Melton, the woman they believed had orchestrated their daughter's murder, living freely, her life continuing while Laura's had been cut short. They became the silent keepers of Laura's memory, their sorrow a cold, hard stone in the belly of the community, a constant, unspoken rebuke to the verdict of the court. And what of Anne? She had won her freedom, but she had lost everything else. The acquittal was not a pardon. It was a life sentence of a different kind. She returned to her farm with James Melton, but she was now a pariah, a ghost in her own life. Old friends would avert their eyes when she passed. Children would fall silent and hide behind their mother's skirts. She was utterly isolated, trapped in a prison of whispers and sideways glances. The community that had once been her stage was now her jury, and its judgment was a slow, daily poison. She was the woman who had gotten away with it, and for that, she would never be forgiven. History simply records that Anne Melton died a few years after the trial, likely from a fever or some other common malady of the time. But the legend, my friends, tells a different story. The legend is where the mountains delivered the justice the court could not. They say that Anne was consumed by the very disease that had started it all, that the syphilis drove her mad, her mind rotting away along with her body. The folklore insists her death was a thing of horror, that for days she was tormented by visions, screaming Laura Foster's name in the dead of night and clawing at phantom hands that were dragging her to hell. The legend gave her an end befitting the monster they believed her to be, agonizing, shameful, and utterly terrifying. It was a curse fulfilled. And so, the community tried to heal by forgetting. After the raw spectacle of the trial and Anne's supposed damnation, a thick blanket of collective silence fell over the story. It was too painful, too divisive. People stopped speaking the names of the dead. The murder of Laura Foster became a dark secret, a story you didn't tell your children, a wound that was left to scar over in private. They buried the truth under the weight of hard work and the passing of seasons, hoping that if they just stopped talking about it, the ghosts of 1866 would finally find their rest. The silence that the community so desperately tried to impose on this story was ultimately broken, not by a historian, but by a musician. In 1958, a clean-cut group of folk singers called the Kingston Trio recorded a simple, haunting ballad called Tom Dooley. The song became a worldwide phenomenon, a #1 hit. It flattened the brutal, complex tragedy into a simple tale of a love triangle gone wrong. The song became a ghost, its mournful tune drifting out of jukeboxes and radios across the country, ensuring that the names Tom Dooley and Laura Foster would never truly be forgotten. It was this song that pulled the story from the dusty archives and gave it a strange new life in the modern world. And the physical traces, my friends, they are still there. You can travel to Wilkes County today and find them. There's a small, fenced-in plot where a gravestone marks the final resting place of Tom Dooley. It's a newer stone, placed there long after the original was chipped away by souvenir hunters. You can also find the quiet, lonely grave of Laura Foster, tucked away in a family cemetery. But the grave of Anne Melton is harder to find. Some say she was buried next to her husband in the Melton family plot, while others whisper that she was laid to rest in an unmarked grave, shunned by a family that could no longer bear the weight of her name. Even in death, she remains a figure of mystery and shadow. The land itself holds the memory. The old hanging tree in Statesville is long gone, but locals can still point to the spot where the gallows stood. And if you know who to ask, they can take you deep into the woods to a quiet, unremarkable patch of ground. There are no markers, no signs. But as you stand there in the silence of the forest, you can't help but feel a chill. This is the place. This is the earth that held Laura Foster's body for a long, hot summer. It is a wound in the landscape that has never fully healed. The descendants of the Fosters, the Meltons, and the Doulas still live in those hills. For generations, the story was a source of deep shame, a dark chapter that was never spoken of aloud. But the fame of the song changed that. It forced the story out into the light, transforming it from a private family tragedy into a piece of public American folklore. Today, the names no longer carry the same immediate sting, but they do carry an echo of a passion that burned too brightly, of a secret that was worth killing for, and of a tragedy that proves that while people may try to forget, the mountains remember everything. So we come back to the question we asked at the very beginning, a question that has echoed through these mountains for over 150 years. Was Anne Melton the true monster in this story? The law gave us its answer. It said no. But the legend, the folklore, and the dying words of the man she loved screamed a different answer from the gallows. The truth, I believe, is buried somewhere in the murky soil between the two. The historical record is silent, but human nature is not. Anne Melton was a fiercely intelligent, passionate woman, trapped in a world that gave her very little power. When faced with total ruin, did she turn to an act of ultimate brutality to save herself? I cannot tell you with certainty that she held the blade. But I believe her will, her fear, and her desperation were the forces that drove the tragedy to its bloody conclusion. This is not just a simple story of a love triangle the way the song tells it. This is a story about the awesome and terrifying power of secrets. It's a testament to how, in the isolated, close-knit world of the mountains, things like honor, shame, and reputation are not abstract ideas. They are matters of life and death. It's a brutal lesson in how love can curdle into obsession, and how obsession, when cornered, can become homicidal. It is a story not just of cruelty, but of the indomitable Appalachian spirit, a spirit that will endure unimaginable hardship, protect its own with a fierce and sometimes violent loyalty, and never, ever forget a wrong. The Kingston Trio made Tom Dooley famous, but they only told you a piece of the tale. They never told you about the disease, the web of family secrets, or the cold, defiant woman who walked free, only to be imprisoned forever by her own legend. The ghosts of that tragedy still wander the hollows of Wilkes County, a timeless reminder of a passion that burned a hole in the fabric of the mountains. They are a warning that the darkest hearts sometimes beat within the most beautiful chests, and that justice, in the end, is not always found in a courtroom. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Imagine a man standing in the twilight of the Appalachian Mountains. A shotgun roars, and the buckshot tears through the air, striking him square in the face. But the man doesn't fall. He doesn't even scream. He simply spits the lead pellets onto the ground as if they were cherry pits, a cold grin spreading across his face. This wasn't a scene from a movie. This was the reality for those who dared to cross Tally Iron Jaws Hall. The whispers in Wise County said he was more than a man. They said he was enchanted, that bullets couldn't kill him. But was he a demon born of mountain folklore? Or was the truth something far stranger, something hidden in the very marrow of his bones? Today, we separate the legend from the man to find out what really made Tally Hall the bandit who couldn't be killed. To understand the man, you must first understand the mountains that made him. In the late 19th century, Wise County, Virginia, was a world unto itself. It was a labyrinth of steep hollows, dense forests, and rushing creeks where the outside world felt a million miles away. The land was both a provider and a tyrant. It gave families corn from the bottomlands and game from the woods, but it demanded back-breaking work in return. Life here was simple, hard, and governed by unwritten laws older than any courthouse. Family was everything, and an insult to your kin was an insult to you. In this world, Mabra Tally Hall was born. He wasn't born a monster or a legend. He was just another mountain boy, learning the ways of his people. And in these parts, the most important craft, the very lifeblood of the local economy, was turning corn into whiskey. Moonshining wasn't seen as a crime by many. It was a tradition, a skill passed from father to son. It was how you turned a surplus crop into cash, how you paid for medicine, tools, or a piece of land to call your own. Tally learned the trade early, mastering the art of the still, understanding the subtle science of fermentation and distillation under the dark Appalachian night. He was a big man, powerfully built from a life of hard labor. People knew him as strong, quiet, and fiercely protective of his own. He worked his still, provided for his family, and lived by the mountain code. In these early days, he was just a distiller, respected for the quality of his product. He was part of a community of others just like him, men who saw the federal government's whiskey tax not as a law to be obeyed, but as an intrusion by a foreign power trying to steal the bread from their tables. The conflict wasn't just about money, it was about pride and independence. The people of these mountains had always taken care of themselves. They built their own homes, grew their own food, and settled their own disputes. The arrival of federal marshals, the revenuers, was seen as a declaration of war on their entire way of life. These outsiders didn't understand the mountains or the people who lived in them. They saw moonshiners as simple criminals, not as farmers and family men trying to survive. And in this simmering tension, the seeds of Tally Hall's future were sown. He wasn't just making whiskey, he was making a stand. Every barrel he sold was an act of defiance. But this quiet rebellion couldn't last forever. The government was determined to enforce its laws, and men like Tally were just as determined to resist. The calm of the mountains was about to be shattered by the crack of rifles, and a simple moonshiner named Tally Hall would soon be forced to become something far more dangerous to survive. The world was coming for him, and it would learn that he would not be taken easily. The law came for Tally Hall not with a polite knock, but with the splintering of wood and the cold gleam of rifle barrels. It happened on a misty morning, deep in a holler where the smell of sour mash hung heavy in the air. Tally was working his still with his brother when two federal marshals, led by a man named Red Blevins, crashed through the undergrowth. They weren't there to talk, they were there to make an example. With a sneer, Blevins kicked over a barrel of fermenting corn, the lifeblood of the Hall family business spilling into the dirt. For a mountain man, this was more than the destruction of property. It was a profound insult, a strike against his pride and his ability to provide. Tally stood frozen for a moment, his massive hands clenched into fists. He didn't say a word. According to the stories passed down, Marshal Blevins then raised his axe, not to the still itself, but to the worm, the delicate copper coil that was the heart of the operation. As the axe came down, something inside Tally Hall snapped. The quiet distiller was gone, and in his place stood something far more primal. What happened next became the first chapter of his legend. Tally didn't reach for a gun. He lunged forward, moving with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He met the marshals not with bullets, but with bone and sinew. He broke one man's arm with a single brutal twist and sent the other flying with a blow to the chest that knocked the wind clean out of him. Red Blevins, the leader, found himself lifted off the ground by his throat, staring into eyes that held no mercy. Tally didn't kill him. He simply threw him down the hillside like a sack of grain, leaving him broken and humiliated. The marshals limped back to the town of Wise, carrying with them not just bruises and broken bones, but a story of a man who fought like a cornered bear. The line had been crossed. This was no longer about an unpaid tax. Tally Hall had assaulted federal officers. A warrant was issued for his arrest, and his name was no longer just whispered among moonshiners. It was now spoken with fear and anger in the courthouse. He was officially a fugitive, a wanted man with a price on his head. Tally knew what this meant. There was no going back. He couldn't return to a quiet life. He had stood his ground, and now the full weight of the law was coming for him. But instead of running, he dug in. He gathered his brothers and his kin, men who believed in the same code he did. The forest that had been his workshop now became his fortress. The first drops of blood had been shed, not by Tally, but by the government's attempt to break him. And Tally Hall had answered in the only language he knew they would understand. The war had begun. With a price on his head, Tally Hall became the most hunted man in Wise County. But hunting him and catching him were two very different things. The mountains were his kingdom, and he moved through them like a ghost. This drove his rivals, other moonshiners whose business he had crushed with his own brand of violent enforcement, to a point of desperation. They decided to do what the law couldn't. They set a trap on the Pound Gap, a treacherous road that snaked through the mountains, a place where a man could disappear without a trace. They waited in the deep shadows as Tally rode alone, a silhouette against the rising moon. As he passed a narrow bend, the night erupted. A shotgun blast, fired from less than 20 feet away, struck him full in the head and upper body. The sound echoed through the holler, a deafening roar that sent birds scattering from the trees. Tally's horse shrieked and crumpled to the ground, its legs tangled in a dying heap. The ambushers stepped out from their cover, rifles ready, expecting to see a body. But Tally Hall was still standing. He swayed on his feet, stunned by the impact. But he did not fall. The men watched in frozen disbelief as he slowly raised a hand to his face. There was a strange, gravelly sound, and then he spat something dark onto a broadleaf plant on the roadside. He did it again and again. The moonlight caught the objects, and the attackers felt a cold dread creep up their spines. They were lead pellets. Buckshot. He was spitting the bullets out of his own flesh. It was in this moment that the man died, and the legend was born. The attackers weren't looking at a moonshiner anymore. They were looking at something torn from the pages of a dark folk tale, a creature the mountains themselves had made. He took a step towards them, his face a mask of cold fury. One of the men, shaking with fear, raised his rifle and fired again. The bullet slammed into Tali's chest with a sickening thud, a sound like a hammer hitting stone. It barely staggered him. The sounds that followed were not of gunfire. They were the sounds of snapping wood as Tali ripped a rifle from one man's hands and broke it over his knee like a twig. They were the dull, heavy thuds of fists meeting flesh, followed by choked-off cries of pain. He didn't use a gun. He didn't need to. He moved among them like a storm, and when the terrible, frantic noise was over, only silence remained. He left the men broken and scattered on that lonely road, a living testament to his unnatural resilience. From that night on, he was no longer just Tali Hall. He was Iron Jaws Hall. The story spread like wildfire, carried on hushed whispers from one holler to the next. They said he was protected by a witch, that he had made a pact with the devil. The truth, doctors would speculate many years later, may have been a rare medical condition called Paget's disease, which causes bones to become abnormally thick and dense, essentially creating a form of natural armor. But in the dark woods of Wise County, no one cared about a medical diagnosis. The only truth that mattered was the one they saw with their own eyes and heard in the terrified tales of the survivors. Tali Hall was enchanted. He was bulletproof, and if you shot him, you had better pray you killed him with the first shot, because you would not get a second. The silence that fell over Pound Gap after the failed ambush was deeper and more terrifying than the roar of the shotgun that had started it. The broken men who dragged themselves back to civilization did not speak of a botched attack. They spoke of a nightmare. They told a story not of a fight, but of an encounter with something inhuman, something that ate lead and paid it back with crushing force. Their words, laced with genuine terror, were far more potent than any rumor. The legend of Iron Jaws Hall was no longer a whispered bit of folklore. It was now a sworn testimony, sealed in fear. Tali Hall himself seemed to understand the power of what had happened. He didn't retreat deeper into the mountains. Instead, he did the opposite. He became more visible, more brazen. He knew that fear was a more effective weapon than any rifle. His reputation preceded him, a silent, invisible guard that cleared his path. Other moonshiners, men who had once been his rivals, now fell in line. They either paid him a tribute to operate, a tax of their own, or they got out of the business entirely. To defy Tali was to challenge a man who bullets supposedly couldn't harm. No one was willing to take that chance. The authorities were now faced with an impossible situation. The reward for Tali's capture was increased, becoming a small fortune for the time. But money meant nothing against superstition. Deputies who were brave enough to face a dozen armed men would hesitate at the thought of confronting Tali Hall alone. Informants dried up, their fear of the law replaced by a much more primal fear of Iron Jaws. The manhunt, once an active pursuit, became a cold case file gathering dust on a shelf. They were hunting a ghost who was very much alive, a man who ruled a shadow empire from the heart of their jurisdiction. The community became a landscape of fear and fascination. On one hand, Tali was a boogeyman. People would lock their doors a little tighter at night, and his name was used to frighten misbehaving children. He was the embodiment of the violence and lawlessness that festered in the deep woods. But on the other hand, a quiet, grudging respect grew for him in some corners. He was a mountain man, one of their own, who was single-handedly defying the federal government and winning. He was a symbol, however dark, of Appalachian grit and refusal to bow down. The ashes of that ambush on Pound Gap were not from a fire, but from the smouldering ruin of Tally Hall's mortality. What was left was a silence born of pure dread. He had become the undisputed king of the Wise County underworld, not just a criminal, but a living legend whose power was rooted in the belief that he could not be killed by ordinary means. The law was powerless, his rivals were terrified, and Tally Iron Jaws Hall walked the mountains not as a fugitive, but as a conqueror. Tally Iron Jaws Hall never stood trial in a courthouse. He was never made to sit on a hard wooden bench and listen to lawyers argue over his fate. The law of men, with its warrants, judges and juries, proved utterly powerless against him. His trial was a rolling, years-long affair, held in the dark hollows and on the treacherous mountain roads. The prosecuting attorneys were the bounty hunters and federal marshals who came for him, and the evidence they presented was the buckshot and rifle slugs they fired his way. The bounty on his head grew to be a legendary sum, drawing daring men from neighboring states. They came with new rifles and hardened resolve, dreaming of the fame and fortune that would come from bringing in Iron Jaws Hall. They formed posses, laid intricate traps, and combed the mountains, convinced they would succeed where others had failed. They were, in effect, a traveling court, come to Wise County to deliver a sentence. But Tally Hall was his own defense attorney, and his arguments were brutally effective. One by one, the posses were outsmarted, the traps were sidestepped, and the bounty hunters were met with a terrifying response. Some were found beaten near to death, left as a warning on the side of a road. Others simply vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. The verdict in each of these violent encounters was the same. Tally Hall walked away. He was judged by the laws of survival, and in that court he was consistently found innocent by virtue of being the last man standing. This was not justice, it was dominance. Tally had replaced the law of the land with his own law of fear. But the justice of the mountains is a patient, cruel thing. For every man he intimidated, he created an enemy. For every family he terrorized, he sowed the seeds of a future reckoning. His invincibility had made him arrogant, and he had forgotten the most fundamental rule of his world. There is always someone tougher, someone more desperate, or someone with a better aim. The final trial came without warning. A lawman, some say a deputy named Doc Swindle, decided the only way to stop a legend was to meet it head-on. He didn't come with a warrant. He came with a rifle and a resolve as hard as the mountain stone. He hunted Tally not as a lawman pursuing a criminal, but as a predator stalking its prey. He found him on a lonely path, and there was no talk, no chance to surrender. The air cracked with the sound of a single, well-aimed shot. This time, Iron Jaws fell. He hit the dirt, and this time he did not get back up. The bullet, they say, was special. Some claim it was silver, others that it was filled with mercury, designed to overcome whatever magic protected him. But whether it was magic or lead, the verdict was finally in. Tally Hall was guilty, and the sentence was death. It was a verdict delivered not by a jury, but by a lone gunman, and it raises the ultimate question. Was this the law of men at last catching its fugitive? Or was it simply the brutal, unforgiving justice of the mountains finally claiming one of its own? Tally Iron Jaws Hall was buried in a small, remote cemetery in Wise County, not far from the lands he once ruled. For years, his grave was marked only by a simple fieldstone, as if even in death, people were afraid to carve his name for fear of what it might conjure. Today, a more formal headstone stands, a silent testament to the man who was once a living terror. Local historians and descendants still visit, standing over the patch of earth that finally managed to hold him, and they wonder. The physical landscape has changed. Pound Gap is no longer a treacherous dirt track, but a paved highway, US Route 23, that carries thousands of cars a day. Commuters and truckers speed through the cut in the mountain, their minds on schedules and destinations, completely unaware that they are passing through the very spot where a man once stood and spat buckshot back at his would-be killers. But for those who know the story, a drive through the gap, especially as evening falls, feels different. The shadows seem deeper, and the wind whistling through the rocks sounds like a whisper from the past. The legend of Iron Jaws has outlived the man by more than a century. It survives in the oral traditions of Appalachia, a story told by grandparents to their grandchildren, a campfire tale that happens to be true. While modern science offers a plausible explanation in the form of Paget's disease, that dry medical term has none of the power or romance of the legend. In the mountains, the story of the enchanted moonshiner who couldn't be killed by bullets remains the preferred version. It speaks to a deeper truth about the region, a belief in the extraordinary, and a deep-seated suspicion of simple explanations. The name Hall still echoes through Wise County and the surrounding region. The descendants carry not just the name, but the complex legacy of their infamous ancestor. For some, it's a dark chapter best forgotten, a stain of violence on the family history. For others, it's a source of a strange, defiant pride, a reminder of an ancestor who refused to bow to anyone, who was a king in his own right, however brutal his reign. The story hasn't vanished. It's simply gone underground, living on in family Bibles and hushed conversations. The mountains remember everything, and the shadow of Tali Iron Jaws Hall is a long one. So we come back to the question that hung in the air at the start of our journey. Was Tali Iron Jaws Hall truly enchanted by bullets? The logical mind points to science, to the rare bone disease that likely turned his skull and ribs into a natural, horrifying armor. And perhaps that is the simple, factual truth. But in the mountains, the truth is rarely simple. The real magic wasn't in his bones, it was in the power of belief. His legend became a weapon more potent than any gun, a shield more effective than any steel plate. The fear he created was so real, so absolute, that it may as well have been a genuine enchantment. This is a story that goes beyond a simple tale of a mountain outlaw. It is a raw and brutal lesson about the soul of Appalachia itself. It's a story about the fierce, untamable spirit of independence, but also a dark warning of what that spirit can become when it's stripped of its humanity. Tali Hall began as a man defending his way of life, a symbol of resistance against an outside world he didn't trust. But in his war against the law, he became a tyrant far more terrifying than any government agent, a monster who preyed on his own people. He is the ultimate Appalachian paradox, a folk hero and a villain forged in the same fire. The story of Iron Jaws teaches us that some legends are born not from fantasy, but from a truth so strange it has to be seen to be believed. He was a man of flesh and blood, but he became something more, an idea, a nightmare, a force of nature. Force. He walked the earth for a time, a king in a kingdom of shadows and fear, until the mountains that created him finally took him back. His name is now a whisper on the wind, a reminder that the old, wild magic of these hills has not entirely faded. And now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Here, on the banks of the Nolichucky River, the water still speaks in the old tongue of the mountains. It tumbles over rocks that have seen empires rise and fall, and it whispers through trees that remember a time when this was the very edge of the world. It was here, in this misty East Tennessee valley, that a man came and took the river's name for his own, branding himself into the landscape forever. They called him Nolichucky Jack. But was he a hero, a rebel, or a king in buckskin? Today, we're going to follow the current back in time, because these waters hold a story of fire, blood, and ambition that shaped the very soul of Appalachia. Let's go back to 1773. Imagine this valley not as a quiet, settled place, but as the raw, bleeding edge of a new continent. This was a world of towering hardwoods and shadow-filled hollows, where the law was whatever a man could enforce with a long rifle and a steady hand. The settlements here, places like Watauga and Holston, weren't towns. They were clusters of raw log cabins huddled together for warmth and safety, islands in a vast, untamed wilderness. This was land that was promised by God, but forbidden by a king across the ocean, and more importantly, it was the ancestral hunting ground of the Cherokee. Into this crucible walked John Sevier. He wasn't born of these mountains. He was a man from Virginia with a hunger for land that was sharper than any axe. When he arrived and built his home on the Nolichucky, he didn't look like a mountain-born brawler. He was handsome, charming, with a gaze that could disarm a rival or win the loyalty of a stranger in a single glance. He had the easy smile of a man who knew deep in his bones that you'd follow him, that you'd trust him with your life. But those who looked closer saw something else. Beneath the charisma was a core of cold, hard steel. This wasn't just a farmer looking for a homestead. This was a born leader, a speculator, a man who saw this forbidden land not just as a home, but as an empire in the making. He was building a life here with his wife and children, but every nail he hammered was an act of defiance against a distant government and a declaration of war against the people who had called this place home for centuries. The air itself was thick with tension. To the west, Cherokee leaders like Dragging Canoe watched the endless stream of settlers and swore a blood oath to drive them back across the mountains. To the east, the whispers of rebellion against the British Crown were growing into a roar. Sevier and his neighbors were caught in the middle, squatters on stolen land, poised on the brink of a war that would force them to choose a side. They had come seeking freedom, but they had found themselves in a powder keg, and John Sevier was the man holding the match. To really understand what forged John Sevier from a simple settler into a legend, you can't just look at maps or read treaties. You have to feel the weight of the times. I'm holding a piece of that weight right here in my hands. It's a trade tomahawk, the kind that were mass-produced in English foundries. The iron head is simple, brutal, and efficient. The hickory handle is smooth from a century of handling. It feels cold, balanced, and deadly. But this isn't just an antique weapon. This is a political document written in steel. When the revolution began, the British had a strategy for their southern frontier: turn the mountains red. They funneled weapons like this one to the Cherokee and other tribes, encouraging them to attack the rebellious settlements. For the British, it was a calculated move in a global war. But for the families living in those isolated cabins, it meant this object became a symbol of their worst nightmares. It was the face of a war that didn't happen on distant battlefields, but on their own doorsteps. This simple tool forces us to ask a visceral question, one that cuts through the pages of history. What happens when the world outside your thin wooden walls is consumed by fire and screams? What does a man like John Sevier do when he's looking over the palisade of a besieged fort and sees a young woman running for her life, with a weapon just like this one slicing through the air right behind her? When the revolution finally broke, it wasn't a glorious affair of flags and cannons on the frontier. It was a wave of pure terror. The British strategy was simple and brutal. They would unleash their allies, the Cherokee, upon the settlements. The war had come to the mountains, and it came on silent, moccasined feet, armed with English steel. Suddenly, every rustle in the woods, every shadow at dusk, could mean death. Cabins were burned, families scattered, and the survivors fled to the flimsy security of their forts. At Fort Watauga, the air was thick with the stench of fear and gunpowder. Hundreds of Cherokee warriors, led by the brilliant and implacable Dragging Canoe, materialized from the forest and laid siege to the crude wooden walls. Inside, John Sevier was no longer just a landowner. He was a commander, responsible for the lives of every man, woman, and child huddled within. The siege was a grinding nightmare of sniper fire, of terrifying war cries that echoed through the night, a constant reminder that death was only a few feet of log wall away. It was during this chaos that the legend of Nollichucky Jack was truly born. A young woman, Catherine Sherrill, was caught outside the walls when the attack began. As she sprinted across the cleared ground toward the fort, she was a lone figure of desperation. She could hear the footsteps pounding behind her, could feel the nearness of her pursuers. A tomahawk, a weapon just like this one, its polished edge glinting in the sun, whizzed past her ear and thudded into the gate just as she reached it. It was barred shut. For a heart-stopping second, her